Shane Baker.
Here.
Shane Baker is here. Jeremiah Carlson. Jeremiah Carlson is not here. John Donovan.
Here.
John Donovan is here. Mark Hazy.
Here.
Mark Hazy is here. Dale Harris.
Here.
Dale Harris is here. Amber Johnson. Amber Johnson is not here. Kelly Mitchell. Kelly Mitchell is here. Mark Osler. Mark Osler is not here. Nate Wright, Wrights.
Okay, got it right the first time. Yeah, here.
Nate Wrights is here. Ken Sass. Ken Sass is not here. Nick Sasser. Nick Sasser is not here. Robert Stewart.
Here.
Robert Stewart is here. Ashley Stewart-Griffith. Stewart-Griffith is not here. We do have a quorum.
All right, thanks, Don. So we'll move on then to the approval of the 2026 minutes. So you've received the minutes from the May 8th, 2026 meeting. Are there any corrections to the minutes that anybody would like to bring to our attention? Any corrections to the minutes? If there are no corrections to the minutes, the minutes will stand approved as drafted. Hearing no corrections, the minutes are approved as drafted. To give us flexibility, I'm not going to ask for any for approval of the agenda, but does anybody have any comments on this very, very full agenda that we have today? I think you'll find that your next 3 hours will be put to good use. But any comments or suggestions with respect to the agenda? All right. If not, we are looking forward to hearing now from MJRC regarding the stakeholder input, and they presented to us in the past some preliminary information that they received, and that was helpful. And now we're going to receive the final findings of stakeholder input, which should inform our discussion today. And who's going to be making that presentation?
Hi, everyone. I'm from the Minnesota Justice Research Center. I'm a research manager, so I'll be presenting with you all today. My colleagues, Jana and Justin, will also be on the line helping me answer questions as well. But yeah, I can get started with that real quick. Just give me one moment to share my screen. Okay. Sorry, this might take me a second. Just I'm not super familiar with WebEx. Center view. I'll move that over to my other monitor, enter full screen mode. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Is everyone able to see the full screen of input on mandatory minimums?
Not yet. It's actually, we could see something just a minute ago, but now we just see a gray screen that says click to exit full screen.
Oh, weird. Okay, let me try. Maybe instead of sharing my window, I'll share my full screen. See if that works. Sorry about that, everyone.
Don, while Jen is getting that ready, if the minutes could just reflect that, who was it that just came on? Amber Johnson just came on. So.
Exit full screen mode. What about now? Is this any better?
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much for helping me out with that. So again, hi, everyone. My name is Janet Casillas. I am a research manager here at the Minnesota Justice Research Center. On the line, my colleagues, Justin Terrell, who's our executive director, and Jenna Kuran, who is our associate executive director, are also on the line. So they'll be helping me answer some questions down the line. But yeah, as they mentioned, we've already presented to the task force before. So here we are presenting the remainder of our findings from our key stakeholders regarding mandatory minimum sentences. So to kick us off, I have a brief agenda of what you can expect from the rest of the presentation. So I'll start off by briefly going over our methods. So just the role that we played in supporting the task force, along with the data collection and how we went about that. And then I'll transition to talking a little bit more about our findings. So last month, Katie was able to talk about our preliminary findings surrounding the understanding and purpose of mandatory minimum sentences. And now that we're done with that phase of analysis, we can dive a little bit more into the findings around the role of mandatory minimum sentences in the case process, as well as the role that mandatory minimum sentences play in the lived experiences and impacts on people's lives. So again, I won't spend a whole lot of time here. You guys are pretty familiar with who we are. The MNJRC, we're an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that is dedicated to driving meaningful change to Minnesota's criminal legal system through rigorous and community-centered research, education, and policy development. We were tasked with supporting the task force by gathering qualitative feedback from the following groups who are directly impacted by mandatory minimum sentences. So these include people who are convicted of crimes with mandatory minimums, their family members, victims of crimes with mandatory minimum sentences, and family members of victims. So for methodology, so going into this project, we aim to gather input from a total of 22 to 35 participants across different stakeholder groups. One of those groups was criminal justice practitioners, who we often refer to here as system actors. So people who are working in the criminal legal space, legal professionals, service providers, etc. Our goal was to have a minimum of 8 responses from them. Additionally, we also sought to have input from a minimum of 6 people who identified as victim survivors or family members. And again, this is of both groups, justice impacted and victim survivors. And then with justice impacted individuals, we were hoping to speak with a minimum of 8 people who had been convicted of crimes with mandatory minimum sentences. In terms of the how, so for our criminal justice practitioners or system actors, we sent out a survey. Though we had a minimum of 8 responses that we were looking for, our goal was ultimately to get over 15. We were also planning on doing one-on-one interviews with victims and family members, just due to the sensitive nature of this topic. We were hoping to, just have like private individual interviews. And then we were also planning on having some follow-up interviews with practitioners who responded to our survey. So our goal for one-on-one interviews with those 3 groups was 8. And then lastly, we were hoping to have 1 to 2 focus groups with participants who were justice impacted, individuals convicted of crimes with mandatory minimum sentences. So who did we actually speak to? So in total, we had input from 95 participants. And just a disclaimer at the top, if you see that the numbers are not adding up, that is something that is due to the fact that we found out, throughout the interview process that many of these folks had overlapping identities, right? So somebody showed up to a focus group for, justice impacted individuals, and then they talked about their experience. But then they also, during that focus group itself, we learned that they also had a lot to say about their experience as a family member of somebody else who was also convicted as a who was also convicted for a mandatory minimum sentence. So we found with a lot of these folks, it was just a lot of overlap. So again, if you see the numbers are not adding up to 95, that is why. But in total, we heard from 77 participants who were system actors / criminal justice practitioners. We heard from 4 folks who were victim survivors and 6 folks who were family members of both victim survivors and individuals convicted under mandatory minimum. And then lastly, we heard from 16 individuals who were justice impacted. So in terms of how we spoke with them, so we had 6 one-on-one interviews. So that's, 2 interviews with victim survivors who identified as victim survivors. And then we learned that some of them had, had other overlapping identities. 2 of them who we interviewed as family members, and another 2 practitioners who we followed up with from their responses in the survey. We also had 2 focus groups. So I believe the number of attendees, we had 6 focus group attendees in one, and then 8 in the other. And then again, we had those 77 survey responses. And in terms of demographics, so we do have the data, right? We have pie charts and tables of the demographic information in terms of both racial and ethnic background, and also the kinds of offenses that were represented, or the kinds of things that people had experience with. But just for the sake of time, I won't really go over that now. If at the end anyone would like to see that, I'm happy to share that with you all. But yeah, I'll just go skip that over for now. But yeah, to kick us off in this research project, the Minnesota Justice Research Center held a consensus workshop with some of you early in March of 2026 in order to help narrow our focus to the topics that were of greatest interest and need for the task force's final report. So following that workshop, we identified a primary objective of the study, which was to understand how mandatory minimum sentences shape the perceptions of fairness and justice across stakeholders. And in order to address this, our research explored 3 key questions. The first being understanding and purpose. So how do impacted individuals, victim survivors, and system actors understand mandatory minimum sentences and their intended purpose in the criminal legal system? The second, the role in the case process. How do mandatory minimums influence decision-making and experiences throughout the case process? And finally, the third, lived experiences and impacts. How do individuals and families experience the effects of mandatory minimum sentences, including the broader personal, familial, and community impacts? So going into our findings, so overall, like one overarching finding that we learned was that mandatory minimum sentences are just poorly understood on their own, and they're largely deemed unfair. But before we go into the findings, I wanted to preface that, when discussing mandatory minimum sentences, and again, that's part of like this fact that they're just not very well understood on their own, is that participants often move beyond discussing like the policy itself of mandatory minimum sentences. So they move beyond that into having like broader conversations about incarceration, about why people are sent to prison, what prison is meant to accomplish, and how it affects individuals, victim survivors, and families. So in many cases for participants, the experience of serving time itself was more salient than like that legal distinction of a mandatory minimum sentence. So as a result of that, many participants understood mandatory minimums as part of larger questions about punishment, incarceration, and public safety. Overall, participants' perceptions of fairness and justice were shaped less by the existence of consequences themselves. So it's not, as throughout these discussions, we learned that it's not like people are against, accountability, against consequences, but they're more, skeptical and curious to just, learn more about or question how these consequences are determined and applied, right? And then just throughout this, we learned that participants have several concerns about fairness and justice. So one of the first concerns raised across stakeholder groups was that mandatory minimum sentences are often unknown by the people who are most directly impacted by them. So justice impacted participants, victim survivors, and family members frequently describe learning about mandatory minimums only after becoming involved in the criminal legal system. Many system actor respondents echo this concern and often question how a sentencing policy can influence behavior when those who are most affected are often unaware of it beforehand. And then participants throughout this project, they also frequently question whether mandatory minimums create meaningful consistency in sentencing. So across stakeholder groups, respondents and participants emphasize that similar charges can arise from vastly different circumstances involving different levels of harm, victimization, personal history, risk, and opportunities for rehabilitation. So many view the inability to account for this context as a central fairness concern. And another factor that contributed to that perception those concerns about fairness and justice is the fact that participants described mandatory minimums as shifting meaningful sentencing discretion away from the judges and towards the prosecutors through charging and plea decisions that they may make. So yeah, it's just a respondent's question whether the consistency is truly achieved when these outcomes can heavily depend on decisions that are made early on in the case process. And then finally, we had many concerns that came up about racial disparities that emerged across all the different stakeholder groups. Many participants described mandatory minimum offenses, particularly firearm and controlled substance-related offenses, as disproportionately impacting Black communities and communities that are generally experiencing higher levels of policing and criminal legal system contact. So taken together, all of these concerns contributed to like this broader skepticism about whether mandatory minimums are promoting fairness, consistency, or equitable outcomes in practice. And so I'll move on to talk about our findings and show some examples of those. So our first finding around the understanding and purpose. So again, as I mentioned earlier, participants across stakeholder groups generally reported that mandatory minimum sentences are just poorly understood by the individuals directly impacted by them. Justice impacted participants, victim survivors, and family members consistently describe themselves and others as largely unaware of mandatory minimum sentencing laws before becoming involved in the criminal legal system. Some participants even reported not learning that their offense carried a mandatory minimum sentence until they were already incarcerated or deep into the case process. And yeah, so, what justice impacted participants are sharing that system actor respondents, including attorneys, judges, law enforcement, and probation officers are largely corroborated these perspectives in their survey. And so here we have some quotes that kind of, bring that to life a little bit for us. So at the top, we have a system actor from Minneapolis who says, your average member of the public has no idea what charges carry mandatory minimums or how long those sentences are. Even people who have gone through the criminal legal system before are often confused about why the judge is not taking into account their personal life circumstances, their remorse, and other individualized considerations. And at the bottom, we have a system actor from Greater Minnesota who says, many individuals that commit these types of crimes, especially first-time offenders and low-risk offenders, have no idea of a minimum mandatory consequence until a court or their attorney informs them. It is not something that anyone thinks about before a crime is committed. I have personally observed the looks on their faces when it takes place during a plea or at sentencing. It is disturbing to watch. So again, as I mentioned, so public defenders consistently reported that defendants are generally unaware of the mandatory minimums until after charges are filed, and then legal counsel explains that this is something that they are facing. Several judges described observing defendants who appeared unaware of mandatory minimum penalties until they were discussed during plea proceedings or sentencing. And even among law enforcement respondents who supported mandatory minimums, many acknowledged that people committing crimes frequently do not think about sentencing consequences at the time of the offense. And then probation officers, through their work, they were able to particularly highlight that many of these offenses occur in situations that are involving substance use, mental health crises, trauma, desperation, coercion, or other survival-related circumstances. So, all these perspectives led many participants to question whether mandatory minimums can function as an effective deterrent when those most affected are often unaware of them before becoming involved in the criminal legal system. And again, so here we have just some more examples of that. Just people questioning whether they can deter behavior when they're often unknown beforehand. To the left, we have a system actor from Minneapolis who says, rarely do people get behind the wheel drunk/high and think, oh, this could be a minimum of 90 days in jail. This is because our faculties are impacted by substances. But even sober, people are rarely motivated by things like mandatory minimums. People are usually only focused on meeting their needs in the moment. Additionally, because most cases take 6 to 12 months to resolve in our area, it is hard to readily connect the consequence to the behavior. And then on the right, we have a quote from one of our justice impacted participants. So just to give a little bit of a background, this was somebody who was in and out of the system for a number of years in his life. He was, repeatedly causing harm. And as he explains, for him, time wasn't the issue. I can do time on my back. I was in and out for 11 years. I didn't care about the time. Mandatory minimum doesn't quite set a point. What ended up saving me is getting more information about me. I learned about myself through trials and tribulations, through the passing of my mother. So again, for this person, again, being in and out of the system for years, this was somebody who was well aware of the consequences, right? Somebody who had already been, to prison a number of times, and that alone, that possibility of going to prison just was not playing a deterrent role in his mind. For him, it took a major life event that kind of sent him on this journey of self-reflection, and that's ultimately what led him to change. But again, it wasn't just that, fear of going to prison alone itself. It had to be some introspective work that happened. Yeah. So still on that point about the understanding and purpose of mandatory minimums, in terms of purpose, so in our survey, system actors were more able to identify some theoretical purposes in their of mandatory minimum sentences, and the four that came up the most were consistency/uniformity in sentencing, deterrence, punishment, and public safety. For justice impacted participants, they were generally more skeptical of any practical purposes attached to mandatory minimums, and so they were more likely to describe mandatory minimums in terms of punishment, harm, or social control. A key theme that emerged throughout the data, so that even though the system actors were able to point to these theoretical purposes of mandatory minimums, there's still they still we're able to name a distinction between like the intended purposes of mandatory minimums and how participants or how they believe they actually function in practice. So even again, as I stated, while respondents could readily identify the stated purposes, mandatory minimums may have been like the intended purposes that they may have been intended to achieve. Many express skepticism about whether those goals are actually realized. And so we saw this a lot throughout the responses, right? So the first question that we had like was, in your words, what do you think is the purpose of a mandatory minimum sentence? So that people wrote in, what they thought those purposes were. And a lot of them were just kind of couched in this skepticism, right? So here on the left, we have two examples of how these answers tended to play out. We have one at the top from a system actor in Minneapolis who says, deterrent, in parentheses, in theory, higher punishment for crimes considered, parentheses again, by some inconsistent definition, more severe. And then similarly, at the bottom, we have another system actor from Greater Minnesota who says, the purpose is to, quote, to make the community feel people are being held accountable, parentheses, even though these minimum/sentences are not evidence-based or calculated in meaningful ways. And again, we saw that a lot. Like we also saw like, shorter responses in this that were formatted along the lines of like allegedly consistency, allegedly deterrence, right? But oftentimes, again, like couched in that just air of skepticism. And and then the follow-up question to that is that we also asked them like if they believe they were effective at like serving the stated purpose. And most of them would state that no, they are very ineffective. But again, like this information from the survey will have that. We'll have those descriptives laid out in the report. So if you're, interested in examining how that played out, how people answered that question, you'll be able to have that information for reference. But yeah, on the right, I have some examples of how justice impacted participants. Perceive the purpose of mandatory minimum. So again, just like for them, it was a bit harder to tie them to a specific practical purpose. So their reactions were often again expressing like these ideas of like harm and racial control, such as we have these two quotes. The one on the top says, they made them for targeted crimes that certain groups of people commit. And at the bottom, we have another participant who says, the easiest way to control a population is through policy. They can still give disparaging sentences to Black folks by giving the power of sentencing to the prosecutors who decide how charges are sentenced. You can't say war on people, you say war on drugs. So again, just overall, just showing the skepticism that participants had about the purposes of mandatory minimum sentences. And then again, just talking about another component of that kind of like bubbled up to that like perception of mandatory minimums being unfair is, their views toward in like their achievement of consistency and punishment. So consistency, before I dive into that, for participants, consistency was deeply tied to equity. So for them, it wasn't just about like giving the people the same number of years, right? Their definition of consistency is more about like who gets a time period. So again, so as I mentioned earlier, turning to consistency and punishment, participants frequently question whether mandatory minimums create meaningful consistency in sentencing, when cases can vary substantially depending on individual circumstances. Across stakeholder groups, respondents and participants emphasize that similar charges can arise from very different situations. As this participant shows, the system actor respondent, the mandatory minimums leave no room to quote unquote, apologies, my cat just jumped on my screen and I don't know what she did. Sorry. Can everyone still see my screen okay? But yeah, here we have a quote from a system actor respondent who says, mandatory minimums leave no room to have the punishment fit the crime. It allows for no discretion in sentencing as it relates to the facts of each individual case. For example, should a loaded firearm on the person of a defendant who was under the influence of drugs while threatening his wife and child be treated the same as the person who has some ammunition in the bottom of a backpack which is stored in the back of his closet? The law says these are exactly the same. And in terms of, again, consistency with the definition of equity, participants raised, several concerns about racial disparities and whether mandatory minimums promote equitable outcomes in practice. Several respondents and participants questioned whether mandatory minimums can meaningfully reduce disparities when inequities already exist earlier in the criminal legal process, again, such as through who is more heavily policed, such as like this participant puts it, I would disagree that mandatory minimums make things more fair because the ratio of people being brought before a judge is already skewed. If the majority of defendants are already Black, it's not really going to make anything more fair. And then, so we have this issue of consistency, and then as we learn, at the same time, punishment emerged as the purpose that participants most consistently believe mandatory minimums actually achieve. So while perspectives varied on the appropriate role of incarceration, respondents and participants broadly agreed that mandatory minimums succeeded in imposing punishment. However, participants call for the importance of accountability. However, many distinguish between support for accountability and support for mandatory minimum sentencing as a mechanism for achieving it. Questioning whether punishment alone imposed without consideration of the individual circumstances ultimately produces fair outcomes, and also questioning about whether that's the appropriate treatment or option for that person. So, for instance, we have this quote from a family member who says, "I don't think punishing someone can make them change if that person doesn't want to change. You can punish him more and more, and still nothing comes out of it. It's more about the person wanting to change from the inside." And that's something that many participants spoke to, like in our justice impacted focus groups. Many just call that, like, if somebody's in prison, they can't just be sitting in prison. There has to be some kind of treatment or something for them happening while they're there. So our second finding around the role in the case process is that participants describe mandatory minimums as fundamentally reshaping the case process by shifting the discretion from the judges to the prosecutors through charging and plea decisions, pressuring some defendants to accept plea deals while pushing others towards trial, and preventing courts from considering rehabilitation, treatment progress, or individual circumstances at sentencing. And so again, from the survey, we heard from a lot of the public defenders that the way that this plays out is, again, it falls largely into the hands of the prosecutor with whether they see that the prosecutor is willing to negotiate down on charges and like maybe leave out a charge that will have a mandatory minimum. If they see that that's the case, they may counsel their client to, take a plea for that charge that doesn't have a mandatory minimum. Whereas if they see that the prosecutor is like that set on bringing forth that charge, they're more likely to go to trial because at that point they just have nothing left to lose. And so here we have a quote from a system actor in Greater Minnesota who describes the dynamic. They say, exposure to mandatory minimums give the prosecution leverage to dictate a sentence even when the judge disagrees. Prosecutors also have the authority to negotiate plea agreements to offenses that do not carry mandatory minimums. The end result is that quote unquote justice is meted out according to the whims and biases, parentheses, implicit or explicit, of the individual prosecutors rather than a consistent application of the law or public policy. Clients who wish to take responsibility for their conduct and who are good candidates for probation are forced to litigate it if the prosecutor is unwilling to negotiate away from the mandatory minimum. And so, many system actors and justice participants alike describe feeling constrained by predetermined outcomes. Oops, sorry, my screen froze. Give me 1 second. Apologies, let me reshare my screen. I'm having some tech issues real quick. Oh, sorry, give me 1 second. Apologies. Sorry, I have a second monitor with my notes and that monitor is not working. So let me reconnect. Okay. Okay, feel free to shout if you can't see my screen. I think we should be good now.
Yep, perfect.
But as I was saying, just many system actors and justice impacted participants alike described feeling constrained by predetermined outcomes. Defense attorneys repeatedly described mandatory minimums as limiting their ability to advocate for individualized outcomes based on treatment progress, rehabilitation, personal history, or demonstrated amenability to probation. And so, and one of the ways, just for the sake of time, one of the ways that this shows up, that kind of constraint shows up in the experiences of participants is this quote that I have on the bottom right. One participant says, what comes to mind when I think of my mandatory minimum sentences, the whole violation of it. All other cases, there is a fight and you can go in there and say your piece, have a lawyer negotiate, witnesses, but with a mandatory minimum, you have to take that to the chin. So again, just describing the constraint that mandatory minimum places on their case process. And in terms, so again, talking about the role of mandatory minimums in the case process, while system actors often discuss mandatory minimums in terms of like charging decisions, plea negotiations, and judicial discretion, justice impacted participants and victim survivors tended to focus on another aspect of the case process, which was also like voice. Many participants emphasize the importance of being able to like share their perspectives of the impact that they experience and to advocate for the outcome that they wish to see as components that would help them feel a sense of justice and repair. Mandatory minimum sentences with their predetermined outcomes don't allow for that. So here we have a couple of quotes. To the left, we have somebody who's a victim survivor, of domestic violence, who said that in their case, there's a mandatory minimum involved, but there's also the fact that, even after it happened, in the event, because I didn't want my son to lose his dad, I didn't really want to press charges. But because of the degree of it, the state kind of took over and I wasn't allowed to do anything besides an impact statement, really. And to feel so small at the point of, that the government is redoing it again, like I don't get to have a voice here either. So this was somebody who felt that didn't want their partner to go to prison just because they didn't feel like the partner was a danger to the child himself and wanted the child to have, their parent growing up. But they didn't, as they mentioned, they didn't get to have a say in that. The person was automatically sentenced to like that mandatory minimum. And then on the right, we asked participants also if they had magic wand, how would they shape sentencing? And we have this quote from a participant who says, sentencing should be a collective thing, like with PSI involved, prosecutor, attorney, and with the victim, because every case is different. These people that were affected by the harm have a say. Some people may be victims of crimes of lower statutes that shouldn't carry mandatory minimum. You have victims advocates speaking out against it and people still get it. So again, just pointing out the inflexibility that comes with mandatory minimums and calling for a vision of sentencing that is, takes into account input for many different actors involved. So for last finding, in terms of like the impact on lived experience, the impact of mandatory minimums on people's lives and lived experiences, this was one of the strongest themes that came across interviews and focus groups. So this idea that like the impact of incarceration as a result of mandatory minimums has on families. So justice impacted participants, victim survivors, family members, and system actors alike described incarceration as something experienced collectively by families rather than solely by the sentenced individual. Participants described the loss of income, instability, housing, and caregiving arrangements, separation between parents and children, and emotional strain that often accompany lengthy incarceration. Several respondents noted that children may lose critical developmental years with parents, as the quote that I shared earlier on, as stated, while family members often assume increased financial and caregiving responsibilities during incarceration. And as an example, we had 2 justice impacted participants in our focus group, and one of our focus groups who described giving birth while incarcerated and losing time with their infants because of the length of their sentences. So these 2 participants, one who was a white woman and one who was a black woman, described the deeply personal impact of their long sentences associated with their drug crimes. Again, both gave birth while in prison. And did not get to have time with their babies because of their sentences. As one participant explains, you're supposed to be with your infant for 2 years, but when you get to prison, they do not actually honor that or give you that. So she missed out on that time with her infant. The other participant, the other woman, she learned that she described not learning that her offense carried a mandatory minimum sentence until she was already incarcerated. So she was devastated by the news, having expected to transfer to boot camp after serving 2/3 of her sentence, only to learn that the mandatory minimum made her ineligible to serve the remaining portion there. Yeah, and again, just building off of that, participants also consistently question whether incarceration alone promotes long-term behavioral change. Justice impacted participants frequently stated that prison itself did not fundamentally change their behavior or address the circumstances contributing to their criminal legal system involvement, such as, the quote that I mentioned earlier about the participant who was in and out of prison. Several participants described cycling repeatedly through incarceration without receiving meaningful support related to addiction, trauma, mental health, house instability, or economic insecurity. Instead, participants often pointed to treatment, recovery, relationships, family responsibilities, and again, major life events as factors that ultimately motivated change. And then, participants also described the long-term consequences of criminal records and incarceration following release from prison. Justice impacted participants discussed barriers to employment, housing, financial stability, and community reintegration that continued long after their sentence was completed. Several participants described feeling trapped between expectations to rebuild their lives and the ongoing limitations imposed by criminal records, supervision requirements, or unsafe environments. And just we have this really powerful quote that kind of exemplifies that. This was from an individual who attended our justice impacted focus groups, but he also had a lot of insight to, from his viewpoint as a family member of somebody who was justice impacted. So he says, I lost my brother for a number of years. When I lost him for 5 years, it took a lot of out of our family. He was the head of the family. As a younger brother, I had to step up. I had been scared of firearms. I get why people had to use them for protection. It made me understand more of what he was going through to have to step up. All the drama that he was facing, he would come be a protector. Trying to avoid the situations was really hard. When I had my kid, I moved because I didn't want to have to stand around and protect him the way that my older brother did for me, and I didn't want to lose my kid the way that we lost my brother 5 years at a time. So overall, taken together, participants consistently describe the impacts of mandatory minimum sentences as extending far beyond the individual sentence, shaping family stability, economic security, emotional well-being, and long-term community outcomes. So before we end up, just want to leave you with a few key points about our findings. Again, participants frequently question whether mandatory minimums achieve consistency in practice, citing concerns about limited consideration of individual circumstances and the disproportionate impact of mandatory minimum offenses on Black communities. Few justice impacted participants reported knowing about or understanding mandatory minimum sentences. Participants consistently described the impacts of mandatory minimum sentences as extending beyond the individual sentence to affect families, children, economic stability, and long-term community well-being. Across stakeholder groups, participants described mandatory minimums as shifting decision-making away from individualized consideration and again, away from the judges and toward predetermined outcomes that often left little room for rehabilitation, victim perspectives, or personal circumstances. And lastly, what perspectives differed on the appropriate role of incarceration, punishment emerged as the only purpose participants believed that was consistently achieved by mandatory minimums. And they questioned whether that was what was most effective to ultimately get people to change their behavior. So yeah, in sum, there's a disconnect between the theoretical purposes of mandatory minimums and how individuals actually experience them in practice. So that's what I have. I hope I didn't go too much over time, but if you have any questions, let me know, and I can also, plan to follow up as well.
Thank you, Janet. That
everyone.
was, I think, very helpful to really humanize the impact of sort of theoretical policy decisions, which I know I can get pretty theoretical sometimes. So I appreciate that grounding. Really quickly, we do have a lot in today's meeting, but if anybody has any questions for Janet or MJRC, that'd be great. All right, not seeing any hands up. So thank you very much, Janet. And I'm assuming there'll be some background materials that have those pie charts that you were talking about, with the demographics and that kind of thing. That'll end up getting to Wilder.
I'm not sure if people in the DOC room are speaking. I can tell you guys like their mouths are moving, but I can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't? Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you guys now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yes, the question was, are there going to be data and the pie charts and stuff that you had mentioned? And the answer is yes, we're going to be merging it with our report. So their report will be in the task force report.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah,
All
exactly.
Right. So you couldn't hear me speaking just a minute ago, Janet?
No, sorry.
Did anybody online hear me speaking? What's that? Speak more into the mic. Okay. All right. No, I was just.
Might have been my cat.
Yeah, I was just thanking you for your presentation and saying it was helpful, at least for me, to sort of humanize the policy, I guess. So thank you. All right.
Yeah, thank you so much for partnering with us.
All right. Next, we have Julia Laskaronsky. Hopefully, somebody's talked to Julia. I haven't talked to her. Okay. All right. Yeah, not wearing a hoodie. That's a good sign. Excellent. Okay. All right. And go ahead and take it away, Julia.
Julia, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes.
And,
Yes.
And can you see the PowerPoint slides?
Yes.
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Laskrinsky. I am back again with some more research for you. The last time I came, I presented some research from my qualitative work on departure decision making. Today, I'm here to present some quantitative work from the administrative data. Today, I'm going to talk about racial and ethnic patterns of downward departures from 609-11 mandatory minimums. I'm going to be using the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines data, the monitoring data, and the years I'm going to be looking at is 2016 through 2024. And I apologize if I'm talking very fast. I know that you have a lot going on today, so I'm trying to get through this very quickly, but I can certainly slow down if you need. Okay, so we have one mandatory minimum statute, that's the 609-11 mandatory minimum, and we have two different mandatory minimums that apply to cases. So what I would call track A is individuals who committed a crime with a weapon. This is a firearm possessed or used or non-firearm dangerous weapon used during a listed offense. Assault 2 dominates here quite a bit. Then you have track B, and this is actually a very different group of people, and these are felons who have been barred from possessing firearms due to a listed crime of violence. So possessing a gun or ammunition after a crime of violence conviction. Analysis in 2016 was because of that 2015 law that now included ammo in the barred felon in possession. So the mandatory minimums are a little bit different, 1 to 5 years for track A, 5-year minimum in track B, and for certain cases, non-departable, although there are some nuances with that, which I will talk about later. And so here, what I am really focused on to really get at this question of how do departure patterns differ when it comes to the mandatory minimum specifically? What I wanted to focus on is what I call binding cases. And these are cases where the minimum, this mandatory minimum, is the deciding factor between prison and probation. And so I'm focusing on individuals who normally, were it not for the mandatory minimum, would have been sentenced to probation, or would have had a presumptive sentence of probation, right? So they're below the dispositional range. Guidelines recommend probation. Here comes the mandatory minimum, and it's potentially going to push them over into a prison sentence, right? And so when we look at those cases specifically for track A, that is using a dangerous weapon during the commission of a specific crime, that number goes down to a little over 2,000 cases, and then that number goes down to almost 2,000 cases with track B, and that's the felon in possession with a crime of violence in the past. So one finding that is I can get to very quickly and doesn't require a lot of modeling is that departures are really common. So when that mandatory minimum has the potential to push somebody into prison, when that mandatory minimum alone has the potential to push somebody into prison, most of the time they actually get probation. So courts grant a downward departure in most cases where the 609-11 minimum would have caused someone to go to prison. And that's in almost 70% of cases for track A and in almost 60% of cases in track B. The departure reasons follow a similar pattern to more non-mandatory minimum departures. So amendability to probation is the #1 reason. And then most departures in the data set are unopposed or plea negotiated. Okay, so the question really is, when a 609-11 mandatory minimum turns a guideline probation case into a prison case, who receives relief from that mandatory minimum? And are those, is that relief racially patterned? So the reason for this question is the legislation creating this task force directs it to examine mandatory minimum sentences for the impact on equity. And so one evaluation domain that you decided on is equity and disparity. So evaluating policies for whether it reduces, perpetuates, or worsens disparities regarding those affected, right? So I'm trying to give you a little bit more information to that fact. And the analysis and this question for 60911 specifically. So are legally similar defendants equally likely to receive relief by race and ethnicity? And before we talk about departure patterns, I think it is also important to talk about who this mandatory minimum applies to, because that's also not, that also has racial patterns, right? So for track A, where an individual is receiving a mandatory minimum due to the commission of crime with a specific weapon, with a dangerous weapon, it's almost evenly split between, or I should say, there's almost an even percentage between Black and white defendants, and then a smaller percentage of other types of races. And for track B, that is that felon in possession with due to a crime of violence. The majority of individuals that the mandatory minimum would apply to are Black. And I will say that there are also some pretty stark district effects here, right? So in 3/4 of cases where the mandatory minimum is applying to a Black defendant, those cases are sentenced in Hennepin and Ramsey County. And my reason for pointing that out is that when we talk about the story of what happens to departures for felon in possession cases, and particularly what happens to departure patterns for Black defendants, we're really talking about what happens in those two counties. And so what I want to do first is just show you the raw differences in rates, right? So if we control for nothing, if we just separate out the departure percentages by race, we can see that individuals who are in track A, actually 71% of white defendants will receive a departure if that mandatory minimum was going to push them over the disposition line. Slightly fewer percentages for Black, American Indian, and Asian defendants, and drops down particularly for Hispanic defendants. For track B, felon in possession, those numbers are a little bit more stark. The actual percentage of individuals who receive a departure who are white is actually almost the same. It was 71% for track A. It's 70% for track B, but the differences, those racial differences, just the raw rates, are quite different in this example. So you see quite lower grants of departures from that mandatory minimum. So a higher percentage are going to prison. And so there's a difference between the numbers I can give you from the raw data, which is what the two previous slides, and this is when all cases are compared as they come. So differences in departures may reflect different types of cases, right? So a really obvious example of this would be that certain districts are more likely to give individuals a departure from a mandatory minimum. And so if certain populations are more likely to end up in those districts, those district effects are going to look like racial and ethnic differences, right? And so we want to try to control that out, or at least adjust for that. So what I can do to do that is to model the effects of those legally relevant variables and case characteristics. So an adjusted model, what it does is it compares like cases with like. So defendants alike in every way that the court record shows that I am able to get from the MSGC data. And so things that I held equal are offense type, criminal history, county district, age, sex, plea versus trial, the year they were sentenced, repeat offense flags. There's probably a couple others that I am not listing. And so hopefully what survives adjustment is the disparity that's observable, that observable case differences can't explain. Okay, so let's look at those adjusted models. So track A, after adjustment, you actually see near parity with one exception. So Black, American Indian, and Asian gaps, while you do see a difference, there is a difference. It goes from 70 to 68 to 65 to 63. They're actually not statistically significant. So the model, just based on how big those how big those groups are, the difference like isn't big enough for the model to be sure that those are a real finding. But the Hispanic finding is statistically significant and meaningful, right? That is a 10 percentage point gap. So individuals who are Hispanic compared to individuals who are white, controlled for a number of legally relevant case factors, their probability of receiving a departure from a mandatory minimum is 10 percentage points lower. And I should also note that that finding survives for track B, but let me just say something really quickly about track B before I give you those results. Track B is actually the cleanest comparison that this data allows because we are looking at the same exact offense, that's felon in possession. We're looking at the same exact severity level, that is severity level 6. And we're looking at the same exact low history range because we need to look at those individuals who are below that dispositional line. And even then, criminal history is controlled in the model. And so the usual explanation of this is actually just picking up different types of offenses or criminal history is less likely here by construction. And so what we find is that among legally similar defendants, the racial gaps remain for track B. And so what you'll notice is these differences look very similar to the raw data, and that's actually the point, right? So what you want to do is you want to start with the raw data, see if there are differences, and then check to see if those differences hold when you control for factors that might be causing those differences, right? And so what we see here is that individuals who are Hispanic, Black, American, Indian, Asian are less likely to get departures from mandatory minimums. So they're less likely to get relief compared to white defendants that are similarly situated. Okay. I want to point out a little bit of exploratory analysis, and the reason I call it exploratory analysis is because some of these groups are actually quite small, and I'm still kind of playing around with that, but I do think the pattern holds enough that there's something interesting about it. So I noticed that the gaps in departure rates concentrate where the gun was possessed, not used. So if we have track B, where it is a felon in possession, where everything is a gun possessed, right? We know a gun was possessed for a felon in possession. But if we separate out individuals in track A who committed a crime from a gun used during the offense to a gun merely possessed during the offense, the results for the gun possessed group actually mirror the felon in possession group more. And so what that tells me is that when there is less discretion in decision making about whether this is a dangerous crime, right? If somebody possessed a gun, how dangerous is that? What harm was caused by that? There's a lot more discretion that can enter in that can enter into the argument here. So I think that when a gun is used, it's more of a shot, open and shut case, right? And so those disparities across races and ethnicities reduce. But when there is more discretion, it increases. Okay. I also wanted to look at for individuals who did receive prison, and that's looking at actually a different group of individuals who are above that disposition line. So for individuals where, and this is just looking at track B right now, this is the felon in possession. So prisons, 20% of prison sentences fall below the 60-month floor that mandatory minimum requires. But the point differences are just not as stark as that difference in the departure from the mandatory minimum. So it's about a 0 to 6 point gap across the racial and ethnic groups compared to the 10 to 26 point dispositional gap. And the median sentence actually for all of this is exactly 6 months, but 16 months, I'm sorry. So the disparity is mainly about whether prison is given, less so for how long it's given. Okay. I also wanted to point one other fact out, which is that first, it's actually really difficult to figure out from the sentencing data alone. And I shouldn't say really difficult, it's actually impossible in many cases to figure out which mandatory minimums are departable and which are not departable. And even when I can put together a group that is from the data would show that it has a non-departable mandatory minimum, I still see departures. They're low. They're much lower than what would be expected for the rest of the sample, but they're still there. So for somebody with a prior, somebody who is charged with a felon in possession who also has a prior felon in possession where the firearm is visible, that's a pretty clear example of a hard mandatory minimum. And even in those, in about 10% of cases, there is still a departure to probation. So the hard mandatory minimums don't always hold. And so some of this is just a data issue. We're trying to get courts data that would show case notes that would actually determine whether the individual held the gun during the crime, whether it was ammo or a firearm or some other weapon being used. And those are things that aren't readily apparent just from the sentencing data alone, and also what determines whether the mandatory minimum is departable or not. So I have three main conclusions. So departures from 60911 mandatory minimums are relatively common. When looking at that group that it would be pushed over the disposition line, and actually other MSGC analysis shows that they're common in general, even when individuals are above that disposition line. And racial disparities in those departures are real. They're concentrated in the felon in possession minimum in the gun possession cases against both tracks specifically. And they are most relevant for dispositional departure decisions as opposed to durational, although there are some differences in durational as well. And the hard mandatories are not always binding. I just want to say I could leave it here, but I want to add 2 more slides because I do think that it can be helpful to put racial differences in context when presenting on them. And so what does it mean for individuals to have, what does it mean for a system to have a racially disparate impact of a policy? And so what I can tell you is probably what you're wondering right now. So what could explain these racial gaps and who receives a departure? What's consistent with the data and prior research is that it could be differential treatment, right? So similar defendants are assessed differently by court and by other parties who negotiate most of these departures, and those assessments could take into account race, and they could differ by race and ethnicity. Another big factor, right, is that it actually is an uneven distribution of circumstances, right? If we think about what the most common factor for departure is, it's amendability to probation, right? If certain racial or ethnic groups have higher or lower amendability to probation, you're going to see racial differences in those departures. And then you're also seeing one decision point in time, right? So everything that I've presented here, all the differences in pattern and departure patterns across race and ethnicity, they're actually also decisions that are based on decisions upstream of the conviction. And there's a lot of research that shows that decisions around plea bargaining and charging decisions, and even upstream of that, detection, police detection, who gets brought in, who doesn't, affect these estimates as well. What I want to be clear is that what this data does not show is individual discrimination. There is no way to tell from group level patterns that any specific judge or prosecutor is making racially discriminatory decisions, right? And most likely it's not any one thing anyway, right? So most likely these racial patterns remain even when you control for other legally relevant variables due to a combination of those factors on the left-hand side. And so I want to finish with this slide because I'm going to answer the question I asked in the beginning, and that question was asked based on your evaluation criteria. So does the 60911 mandatory minimum worsen disparities? I mean, in practice, yes, it does. And it does because the mandatory minimum creates the prison default for individuals in binding cases where the guidelines recommend probation, but the 60911 mandatory minimum calls for prison, right? And then departure discretion determines who avoids it, right? And possibly that is operating through amendability to probation assessments. It could be operating through other things. The data on its face cannot actually determine that, right? That takes another level of research. And the relief, right, from that prison sentence is not distributed evenly by race and ethnicity, even among legally similar defendants. And I'll just go ahead and point out again that this finding really is concentrated in the gun possession cases specifically. Happy to answer questions or provide more info, but I will end it here.
Thank you, Juliet. That was really, really interesting and delivered in time. So I very much appreciate that. I would just add one other statistic from our January materials regarding departures from hard mandatory minimums. And I think one of the reasons why it's so hard with 60911 is because 60911 is so confusing when it comes to what mandatory minimums are hard. I very much doubt practitioners even understand it. There are factors that would have no relevance in the previous case, which if present in the previous case would make the current case hard. For example, possession of a weapon other than a firearm makes the current offense in the prior offense, even though it didn't trigger a mandatory minimum in the prior offense, if that occurred, that would make the current offense a hard mandatory, a non-waivable mandatory, which is like, how would you ever know that? But where it's a little more easy to tell, which is in the controlled substance arena, the only one that's discretionary is possession, first-degree possession of a large amount. So if you just look at the HARs, which are first-degree sale of a large amount, and the subsequents, you see about a 25% departure rate from those. So basically 25% of the sentences are illegal, I think you could technically say. All right, our next, any really quick questions for Julia? Again, I'm excited to be able to stay on time, so I'd like to move on. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Rob Stewart from the Data Committee. Rob, take it away.
Hi, everybody. And thank you, Julia. That was great. And I think really helpful. And I think I wanted to provide I thought I'd provide a little context. Actually, it flows actually nicely into some of the stuff that Julia presented. So let's pretend like this is not my first day and remember how to share a screen. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you can see that slide. So, yeah, so I just have a couple quick slides, so we're not going to spend a bunch of time on this, but so a couple weeks back we had talked about crimes of violence and kind of, and Nate had brought up or the chair had brought up talking about recidivism as it relates to crimes of violence, and so I wanted to present one thing on that just to talk about kind of just show you what the recidivism rates are like for crimes of violence, because of course these are the triggering things for these person in possession of a or prohibited person in possession of a firearm cases that Julia had just talked about. And then additionally, I was just going to present a couple quick slides on. I did an analysis of the kind of a narrative analysis of charging documents for failure to register, first-time failure to register cases, and I just wanted to give you kind of a sense of what were the main reasons, at least listed in the charging documents, for that like triggered that failure to register charge. So starting first, talking about crimes of violence. Essentially, what I did is I wanted to know whether or not if a person were to complete a sentence for a crime of violence, or at least an incarcerated element of that sentence. So if they go to prison, right, so it would be the 2/3. And then so from the date that they get out of prison or get out of jail or whatever it might be, how long do people go without a new conviction? And then when does like the reoffense risk occur? And so to do this, I took I used Minnesota sentencing guidelines, felony sentencing data from 2004 to 2024, and then I supplemented that with data from the state court administrator's office, which includes restricted court records. Not restricted, they're not publicly available, but it's the types of records that you would get if you search on Mints, or it's not Mint, whatever it's called now, Macro, whatever, the old Minces. And so I used a person level linkage using a probabilistic matching tool. We don't need to get into that if you don't care. But basically what I did is, when you look at the sentencing guidelines data, that only isn't going to include felony level offenses, but the crimes of violence, chapters, subdivisions, they include more than that. They include some misdemeanor stuff and some other things. And so I wanted to make sure that we have kind of a full picture, right? And so the clock, we start the period at 2004, we go through 2023. Within this 20-year period, identified 92,804 individuals who were convicted of a crime and violence in that period. And then I basically just, this is very descriptive. I just looked at their first failure. And then I also wanted to see whether or not, if we were to restart the clock, how long it takes for people to recidivate. And this will just give us a sense of kind of the prevalence of recidivism amongst this group. The one thing I want to say is that the failure date, so I'm going to show you some survival analyses, but the failure date is basically pegged at the date of the new offense of a conviction. So if a person is convicted of a new crime, then I back up to the date of the new offense as it's listed in the in the court records. That way we don't lose people who say get a date of a new offense or a new conviction in 12 years, but really the offense happened in 9 years. That way they're still included in this group. So the first thing we're looking at, this is a hazard, just a hazard ratio, looking at a hazard rate of new convictions over time. So essentially what this is just telling us is, among the people who are still conviction free at a particular given point, this is the smoothed annual rate at which a new conviction occurs. And so the blue line represents people can be in this blue line multiple times. So let's say, if a person gets to year one, about 32 out of 100 people within year one, let's start in the red line. The red line is the first fail only. So for people that get to year one, which is right around here, 25 out of every 100 people in that first year are going to fail, right? They'll get a new conviction. They will never show up in this red line again. The blue line is for those people who fail at this point or any point along the line. Then they start over, the clock starts over, and then continues to repeat until they're just conviction free, at least till the end of the observation window. And so the point of this, the numbers are really less important. What's really important is really the shape of the of the lines. And so a steep shape in the beginning tells us that most of the people the highest risk period is at the beginning part, right, of after people get released or after people re-enter the community. And I think that makes sense for most people, right? The bulk of people are going to commit new crimes within a couple of years. And that's just going to be, that's just kind of the way it is, right? And so recency is really important. But then once we get down to about 7.5, 10 years or so, we're talking about very few people relatively who are recommitting new crimes. And so when we get down to 10 years, for example, and this is what Nate had had pointed at, he was interested in talking about this at the 10-year threshold. So at 10 years, basically what this shows us is that 2 out of every 100 people who survive, right, who don't have a failure up to this point, 2 out of 10 of those people will get a new crime conviction within the next year, okay? The second graph that I want to show you is a survival curve. And so this is the people who survive, right? These are the people who don't have failures, right? And so again, looking at the red line, these are the people for the first failures. Yes, looking at the people, the red line is the first failure. And so when we get to 5 years, for example, 42% of, it starts at 100%, and the 100% is because nobody fails at the beginning. You have to, at time 0, you can't fail. And then once you get to time 1, you can start failing. And so again, we see this steep line. And once we get to 5 years, we still have 42% of people who have a prior crime of violence who have not failed. Once we get to 10 years, it's 35%. Once we get to 15 years, that's 15%. And again, this is just of people who have the first time offense or a first time failure. Like they once they got a crime of violence or the crime of violence conviction at 10 years, 35% of those people are still without a conviction and have no new conviction at that point. And so the reason I wanted to bring this up is I just wanted to kind of give a sense of the scope, right? When we talk about the lifetime ban on firearm possession, it's a lifetime ban. What I'm trying to say, or what I'm trying to show with this, though, I think is useful to know, is that really once you get out to 8, 9, 10 years, you're really, it's kind of like when you've gone that long, you're just probably not going to get a new conviction after that point. And to be clear, this is any new conviction. This is a misdemeanor, the gross misdemeanor, anything like that. So it's not just limited to like new felony level offenses. So before I move forward to the next thing, I just want to see if there's any questions about this at all or any clarifying questions that I can help answer.
Yeah, can I restate this chart by saying, like, it looks like if you were to have a 10-year crime-free requirement for reinstatement, then only 27% of the folks would qualify for that. Is that another way of saying this?
No, 35. So the 35% is individual level, right? So if you were to say, okay, you get crime of violence number 1, you do your sentence, and then 35% of the people in that, with that one single crime of violence, 35% of people would still have no new conviction by the 10-year mark. The blue line is, it includes restarts. So a person could go, 2.5 years, but they get a new case and then they start back at 0. And so that's why it's lower. The gap between 35% and 25% is basically people who are committing repeat offenses.
Yeah. What I had proposed was exactly that, right? That the clock restarts upon a conviction. And so only 27% of folks would actually get their weapons back then. Or to put it another way, we're kind of unnecessarily depriving 27% of the folks of their weapons since they're safe at that point. We know they're the safe ones.
Yes, although I wouldn't marry the number because of we are limited by 20 years, right? And so if I were to expand this back 10 years, that number would be higher because we have a lot of people. The other thing I didn't mention is I'm limiting it to people who turn 18 on or after 2004 because I don't want to miss a prior crime of violence before they you know, I don't want somebody who's 25 at 2004 who had 2 previous crimes of violence. So just to clarify that. The number would probably, this 27% would actually probably be higher, but we just don't have that much runway out to show. So some people are ending here and then, you know, earlier in this process, and they're what we call right censored. In other words, we don't have more information on them. So they're just no longer included in this group anymore. They're no longer included in the calculation, in the denominator, basically. But yes, to your point, this number down here represents the people for whom we're taking their guns away or their whatever bullets, I guess, or whatever, but who are really, you know, pretty low risk. The one thing we don't have, and the thing that makes this a little more difficult, is we don't have like a, and maybe, you know, I can look into doing this, but we don't have a baseline comparison, say, of people who have never been. Well, actually, now that I just said that, I could have created that, so I apologize. So usually when you do something like this, you want to have something to compare it to. And so we could include a baseline comparison, which then looks at like people who have been convicted of other types of crime that are not crimes of violence, to see whether or not, you know, the recidivism, you know, how their recidivism curve compares to those people. But yes, to your question, I'm sorry for the 10-minute answer, but to your question, yes, 27% of people, you know, are people who don't have access to gun, or, you know, for whom we're not saying you can't have a gun, but for whom we're not engaging in new crimes of violence. Have gone 10 years.
Okay, somebody else had a question?
Yeah, I did. So this is new crimes of violence, so it wouldn't include.
Sorry. Sorry, Mark. I didn't mean new crimes of violence. It's a first crime of violence is the initiating thing, then any new conviction whatsoever.
Okay. Wasn't the previous slide about new crimes of violence?
New convictions as well.
Okay.
So what
those
this tells us
convictions
is
could be, those new convictions could be nonviolent convictions.
it could be a driving after suspension.
Yeah,
It could be a
all kinds
shoplifting.
of-
It could be literally anything. Or any,
Yeah.
maybe it couldn't be a driving after suspension, but it could be any new misdemeanor or up.
I would be really curious to know what percentage of people within that first 10 years commits another crime of violence.
I could give you that. It's within, it's less, it's low. It's within 10. I mean,
the reason for these prohibitions is you don't want people who are going to do violent things to be using firearms, right? I mean, I guess that's arguable, but that to me seems the main point of it.
I think so I had that was an original form of the analysis. I think I moved towards this kind of basically 10 years crime free, in part because that was how Nate phrased it in the first place. But the other was because I think, you know, it's maybe a more potent, more clear, more bright line signal to say 10 years crime free, you know. Okay, you want to go hunting or something, maybe, or whatever. I mean, I guess I'm not really advocating for this one way or the other, as much as I'm just trying to say what is the more kind of conservative way to look at this. The other concern is that the crimes of violence statute, although it doesn't change a lot, it can change, and so that's another thing to think about. But the one other point is the specific crime of violence makes a difference, like what the triggering crime of violence is. There are lots of crimes of violence that have a very, very low, you know, future recidivism rate. And then there's others. I think it was like ag robbery or something, which has got a really, you know, a lot of failure. So like, you know, a lot of these like, you know, negative cases are made up for those kinds of repeat robbery or repeat crimes of violence like that.
Thanks.
And Mark, that was the legal standard before it was changed to lifetime. It was 10 years, no crime of violence. I'm suggesting a very, very conservative standard of saying 10 years crime free. Just because it's got to be better than lifetime, right? I mean, we're pretty confident these people are safe if they've gone 10 years without a conviction or incarceration following a conviction. But
Well, to Rob's example, are you considering driving after a suspended license?
that's the way it's
Non-crime?
currently worded. Yep. Any crime.
The reason I hedge on the driving after suspension is the payables list. Like I'd have to go back into the analysis to remember exactly how I handled that because of the level of conviction versus the level of sentence, which is from an analyst perspective, the most confusing thing in the world. But I'll set that aside for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, the point is, something fairly minor could trigger it.
Right. Shane?
When you're saying from the 10 years spent, are these individuals out of custody, or could they also be including the incarcerated population? So like if they're serving a murder sentence.
The clock only starts when they're out of prison. So if they're in prison or they're in jail, the jail estimate is a little shakier just because the courts don't have great jail data, right?
Yeah.
But it's it's within a year. So I mean, but with people in prison for long periods of time, I have good data on that as well as that's pretty easy to predict.
Okay, so that population's not getting looped into this crime-free population merely because they're serving a murder sentence and they're in for 10, 15 plus years.
Yeah, and actually, now that you say that, to that point, that is correct what you just said. The other thing is, many of those people might not be in this at all because if they have a 20-year prison sentence, they won't be in this. They'll never have been out, so they wouldn't have. So that a longer period would also help to bring in some of those people as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have this is not a question for you, Rob, but maybe this was covered before I joined the task force. Have we looked at how many petitions for firearm rights restoration are filed every year and what the percentage of success is?
I'm not sure where that metric is kept. If there is somewhere it's kept, I'm not aware of it. Judge Harris?
I was just going to ask, is there any way to separate firearms bans based on state law versus federal law? Because some of this might wind up being an academic dispute if somebody's got a lifetime ban under 18 U.S.C. 921 F or G, whichever one it is.
Yeah, for the misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence. I mean, my understanding of federal law is the felony ban is really tied into state law. So if the state has reinstated your right to possess a firearm, it's likely that the feds will too. But yeah, the misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, ironically, is more restrictive. So that's a hard lifetime ban.
So from an analytical perspective, I'm not not a lawyer. I don't know exactly what the characteristics of, or the details of that is. But I mean, that can be separate. Like I could show separate lines. For example, if domestic violence are lifetime bans, I mean, I could remove, or the misdemeanor ones, I could remove them or do them separately as well. It's just getting to know what these, what goes into what category.
It's also, I would argue, not entirely academic, Judge Harris, because violating the federal ban is a gross misdemeanor in Minnesota, whereas violating the crime of violence is a felony with a 5-year mandatory minimum. So
that's fair.
It's a big difference.
Okay, and seeing no other questions, I'll jump to the one other thing, and so this would be really quick. Basically, what I looked at was there have been ongoing questions about predatory registration failure or failure to register as a predatory offender. I think first we were focusing on first-time offenses, and if I remember correctly, I think the mandatory minimum right now is a year or a year and a day or something like that. And so what I looked at was basically I just got charging documents for all cases that I could find from 2020 to 2023, which includes cases from the sentencing guidelines, so felony level convictions, stays of imposition, etc. But I also have cases in this that included stays of adjudication, so that, I guess, avoid the mandatory minimum in that way. So in total, there were 624 cases in the sample that I was able to be confident that they were first-time offenses, because sometimes first-time offenses they're charged as first-time offenses, but they're really not. And so I was confident in 624 of these cases that they were first-time failures to register. And then I'm just going to show you the categories. The categories are kind of rough because, these are based on more or less charging documents, police reports, that kind of thing. 6 out of 10 are because a person failure to register is because a person moved and just didn't update their registration, right? And that was pretty frequent, where a lot of times it would be like the quote would be that they registered at an address, they moved somewhere else, and then they just didn't update it. And then vehicle or other registration, maybe that like employment or other kinds of things, keeping that kind of thing updated. That was about 12%. Homelessness was the thing that we were particularly talking about. And so this is where people who are registered as homeless, they were missing, if they were missing weekly check-ins, how much was accounted for that? And so that was, again, about 12%. And then the rest were kind of some of these other, details about, people getting out of jail and not, filling out the form or whatever. But just to give you a sense, so about 12% of people who have first-time offenses, first-time failure to register offenses, were people who had registered as homeless. It wasn't always clear whether the person was homeless or not, because this is these charging documents are not made for me to analyze, and so I'm coming in kind of trying to figure out what they mean. So. But hopefully that is also somewhat helpful when thinking about the predatory registration requirement, or not requirement, but mandatory minimum. Anybody have any questions about this? Okay, sounds good. That's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. All of you. That was just such interesting information. Any reports? Well, Mark Osler's not here today, so he gets skipped. Rob, I'm going to count that as your committee report, unless you have anything else to add. And I'll ask Assistant Commissioner Mitchell if she has any reports from her committee. You kind of got your report out too. So, all right, I'm going to move into then the second half of our meeting, which is reviewing and discussing the decision points. I'm going to just share a little bit of information about some of the materials that I put forth. So I kind of created this committee that consisted essentially a subcommittee, I guess, of Mark Osler's committee. I think it kind of turned into just about everybody on the committee except Mark Osler, and because he was out of the country, and then myself and the chair. So just trying to keep it below a quorum. Just to kind of run past some ideas, and these two documents that you have before you are the result of me communicating with the folks on I'll call it the policy subcommittee. The one has to do with drug crimes on the two crime lists, 60911 and 624-712. So there are two these sort of, I don't know, violent crime lists. The one in 624-712 is called a crime of violence list, and that's the one that triggers a lifetime ban. That's the one where I had previously suggested limiting the drug offenses to actually violent crimes. I didn't think it was you could say with a straight face that every drug offense is a violent crime. And then in talking to the policy subcommittee, there was some interest in actually also looking at the membership on the unnamed crime list in Minnesota 60911 subdivision 9. So I think that's also intended to be a violent crime list. There's also a third violent crime list in 609-1095. And maybe one thing we should look at is just consolidating the violent crime list. I kind of thought that was going to be too big of a pill for us to swallow. So I really didn't look at the 6 to 9/11 crime list, or just keeping it the same. But because there was some interest in changing the membership of the 6 to 9/11 list as well, I'm open to looking at that if you think we have the bandwidth to do that. So the alternative framework that I put out does make some changes to the 6 to 9/11 list. Basically, I think there's some. I list on this memo 4 different ways that I think are rational to limit the just saying. I think 5th degree possession. Okay, let's just talk about what we're talking about. 5th degree possession is not only the most common drug crime; it's the most common crime. It's the most common felony in the state of Minnesota, and so that crime, doesn't have any element of violence. I'll just put that out there as my personal opinion. It's just somebody, using drugs basically, and we find them with the drugs on themselves. So it's not a sale. Keep in mind, sale includes possession with intent to sell. So it's not even possession with intent to sell. It's just by definition personal possession. And sale includes giving away too. So it's literally just personal possession by definition. So what would be rational ways to divide up to limit these both lists? I guess we can talk about I had previously recommended just those with elements of firearms possession as crimes of violence. So that would be one approach. And then a second approach would be to look at the drug crimes that are classified as violent crimes on 609-1095. So 609-1095 has a list of violent crimes. It includes drug crimes. It actually kind of has 2 lists. So for purposes of 609-1095 subdivision 2, it excludes, it has 2 listed crimes, which are exposing a child to fentanyl and exposing a child or vulnerable adult to methamphetamines or related chemicals. And then everything else has to be 15 years stat max or longer. And that includes pretty much everything 4th degree and up. And then you have the other one under 609-1095 is subdivision 3. And I don't know why they have 2 different lists, but for that one, they exclude I think 3rd and 4th degree. So it's only 1st and 2nd degree, and then several other offenses that have a stat max of 15 years or more, and then those 2 exposure crimes. So like importation, that kind of thing. So pretty interesting list. And then the 4th approach is, this is the one that I proposed in the June alternative framework that I'll talk about in just a second, has to do with it's loosely based on 152.18, which is a stay of adjudication statute, and there are several crimes that are eligible for deferred prosecution, and those I think the legislature's kind of already made a statement. Hey, these aren't necessarily violent crimes, and I kind of extended the list. The list has not been updated recently, so I did extend it. It seems like they're looking at sale of drugs. So if it didn't involve a sale of drugs, I basically took it off. So the focus there is on 1st and 2nd degree, and then drug sale offenses, also importation offenses, and possession of substances with intent to manufacture. So those are, I guess, 4 different approaches to looking at the list. And we can talk about this later, but I just wanted to alert you that that's new information, and that's new information because of what I've been talking to the policy committee about. There was some interest in doing some changes to the 6 and 9/11 list. The second item that I wanted to talk to you about has to do with, let's see, Don, can you give me sharing privileges, please? Has to do with this new memo called Replacing 6 and 9/11 Alternative Frameworks. Okay. So So this memo, so basically it encapsulates the previous recommendation that I had made, which, you know, I think really I heard a lot of what this recommendation, the first recommendation, so that what I'm calling the April-May framework, which is highlighted here in blue. And for purposes of simplicity, I've converted the stat max increase. I've assumed that the Sentencing Guidelines Commission is going to convert the 5-year stat max increase to a 12-year increase in the duration, right? Because that's what they did for gangs. Actually, that's what they just preliminarily did last week for another 5-year stat max increase that the legislature created for committing a crime while impersonating a peace officer. So effective August 1st, any felony that you commit while impersonating a peace officer will have a 5-year increase in the statutory maximum above what it would have had otherwise. And the Sentencing Guidelines Commission is preliminarily proposing to increase the duration of that of the penalty that would otherwise apply by 1 year. That's exactly what I'm assuming they're going to do here. Convert that 5-year penalty stat max increase into a 12-year month bump. So all that to say is, you know, there's a lot of confusion about what the mandatory minimum is. I think this case is this particular proposal has the virtue of simplicity. You can explain it to somebody in 2 sentences. If you commit a violent crime while using a firearm, you're going to go to prison for 12 months longer than you otherwise would have. And if your use of the firearm is prohibited due to your prior commission of a violent crime, you're going to go to prison for 24 months longer than you would have done. So that's the policy. It's pretty easy to explain. It's pretty easy to understand. And I think it really achieves a lot of what people need in terms of, you know, it's not a deterrent if people don't get it. And our current policy is pretty confusing. And this would be simpler. So that was my April-May framework. Based on talking with some members of the policy committee, and I can't say this was unanimous, I'm proposing an alternative framework for you to consider, and you can consider whatever you want, but nobody else is coming up with frameworks, so I keep popping them out. So the June one is, I'm not saying I'm supporting the June one and withdrawing my support for the April-May one. I'll support whatever you all support. I think any of this is better than 6 and 9/11. And I lay out the reasons for that in this memo, and I've talked about that ad nauseum, but basically 6 and 9/11, and this came up in our stakeholder input, 6 and 9/11 is most harshly punishing the people with low criminal histories and low severity offenses. And and the people committing high severity offenses or the people with high criminal histories don't get touched by it because the sentencing guidelines would already give them that much time. So this actually tacks on 12 months on top of the sentencing guidelines time, which is its virtue. So the June framework is admittedly more complex, but I think it's also understandable still. Basically, it takes that 12-month bump and it turns it into a grid time mandatory minimum. So it does convert, you know, and you know, Julia's research might go against this in a way, because I think Julia, her research to me sort of corroborated the sentencing guidelines, right? Because the high departures were in those cases where the mandatory minimum took a stayed sentence and turned it into a commit, which is what the sentencing guidelines do now. And essentially this square here, the yes grid time, is where we get those high departures. So maybe we don't want to do this, but this is what the June alternative is it takes these cases where somebody's using a firearm to commit a designated crime. And it says, yeah, not only do you get 12 months added to the duration, but the disposition changes to a prison commit in all cases. And then if the firearm is discharged, it's actually a non-waivable hard mandatory minimum. And we've seen that there are even departures from that. You know, and you know, by making it a mandatory minimum, by making a non-waivable mandatory minimum, I thought it was an excellent point that you're cutting out essentially the victims, right? I mean, they no longer have a say in the case. So they've been victimized once already, and now they're being victimized again. They no longer have an opportunity to provide any input. The other non-waivable factor would be if there was a previous mandatory minimum. If this had happened before, basically, you had used a firearm in the commission of a designated crime.
So
And
I have
then-
a question on that, Nate.
Yes, sir.
Is that where you get the up to 24 months if it was a previous one?
So
They had a
none-
previous one and this is a new
No,
one? It would
no.
be 24
No,
months?
so the way I've got it written up, and there's different ways to do this, right? Like it's, like I said, it's Lego blocks. You can do whatever you want, but the way I've written this up is the duration is solely controlled by use of a firearm in the commission of a designated crime, or you get 12 months more if that use was already prohibited due to your prior conviction of a crime of violence. So that gets you up to the 24 months.
Yeah.
The hard mandatory minimum is if you had already had one of these mandatory minimums apply to you before. So if you had previously used a firearm in the commission of a designated crime, which one of those designated crimes is felon in possession. But if you had previously used a firearm in the commission of a designated crime. So let's say you had a prior felon in possession, but you just possessed it. You didn't actually use it in any way. It was mere possession. This mandatory minimum would not have applied to you. So this non-waivability would not apply to you. It would only be if you had used a firearm in a prior designated crime, and now you're using a firearm again in a prior designated crime, then this would make this mandatory minimum not waivable. But in all other cases, it would be waivable. Yeah, if the firearm was, I do have a hunting exception for firearm discharged if the current crime of violence is in fact felon in possession and you discharge the firearm, but no other crime of violence was committed, no other designated crime was committed, then that could just be somebody out hunting. And that's still a mandatory minimum here under this scenario, 12-month mandatory minimum, but it would not be a non-waivable mandatory minimum in that case. So this is, it does add some complexity. It definitely makes it harder to make as an elevator pitch. But I mean, you still have the essence. I guess you could just say, if you, if you commit a firearm, if you use a firearm to commit a crime of violence, you're going to prison for 12 months longer than you would have. And if it was a stay, it'll be a commit. So there's that additional thing. And by the way, there'll be another 12 months added if you weren't allowed to use the firearm in the first place due to a prior conviction of a crime of violence. And if you discharge the firearm, the judge has no discretion. The judge will send you to prison for that period of time. And this applies to all these dangerous offenses. Both of these apply to dangerous offenses that now are essentially untouched, right? The crimes that we're really worried about, things like first-degree aggravated robbery, well, those are so far, those penalties are so high that they don't get the mandatory minimums. Well, they will now. They'll get an additional 12 months if they use a firearm in the commission of that designated crime.
Can I ask a definition question?
Yes, sir.
Does grid time mean the range or grid time mean the presumptive?
The range.
Okay.
Yeah. So the box, anything in the box is fair game.
Okay.
That was my intention on how I wrote it. Then we get to this. So this is another new area. And again, these are Lego blocks. You can cut anything off that you want. But so this has the possession of a firearm or use of a dangerous weapon other than a firearm. So those are the two 6-9-11 categories that we saw a lot of departures from. Those only have a durational change. So this mandatory minimum grid time thing does not apply to that. And the durational change is half of what it would be if they had actually used the firearm. And that would be 6 months increase. And then there's another 6 months increase. It's only possible for possession of a firearm. It doesn't apply to use of a dangerous weapon other than a firearm. And that would be if the possession was already illegal due to a prior crime of violence.
Yeah, it's.
And to be clear, Amber, can you mute? Or actually, can you mute Amber, please? So one thing to note here, though, is possession is not possession the way it's currently defined. Possession is limited to personal possession. So it's got to be possession on the person or within immediate reach, the same standard that we find in drug crimes. So if you possess a firearm or use a dangerous weapon other than a firearm, you get 6 months duration, no change to disposition, and another 6 months if that possession of a firearm was illegal due to a crime of violence. So
Nate, can we like maybe go through a few examples of how this would play out? I mean, I definitely get if somebody's the crime of violence is a serious enough offense for that to be a presumptive commit based on their criminal history score. It's just going to add time, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I'm more
So,
interested in the
sure.
lower level, like, you know, take a crime of violence that's on the that's a presumptive, you know, assume somebody has no criminal history or little,
Sure.
and
Well, and I think it's
probation right now.
sure. I think it's worthwhile talking about second degree assault and I'll assume second degree assault without substantial bodily harm resulting. So that's a severity level 6 offense. With substantial bodily harm resulting is going to be a severity level 7 offense on August 1st. But I think the normal one is second degree assault with no substantial bodily harm resulting. The other one is felon in possession, right? Possession of a firearm or ammunition after a crime of violence. So let's just kind of walk through these. So I commit second degree assault by, so I'm pretty much going to have to use a dangerous weapon to commit second degree assault, right? The possession is pretty much off the table unless I have a second weapon that I'm possessing or something like that. So second degree assault, I wave a knife around at, in an assaulting way. So I get an additional 6 months here because I used, actually I wouldn't. So that because you cannot commit second degree assault without using a dangerous weapon, this 6 months does not apply because anytime there would be double counting, I eliminate that as an option. So this 6 months would not apply to second degree assault because you have to use a dangerous weapon or of some sort. You can't commit the crime without using a dangerous weapon. So this 6 months would not apply. However, if I did it with a firearm and if I used a firearm, then it would be up here. So if I used a firearm to commit a designated, so I waved around a firearm in a threatening manner, that would be use of a firearm. So the 21 months stayed would become 33 months, trying to do math in my head, 33-month commit.
Okay, so that, can we just stop on that? Because
Yep.
I was trying to understand that. It wouldn't be like a minimum 12-month commit. It would make it whatever so for level 6 on the guidelines, second degree is 21 months, as you said. If the use of firearm, it would be a mandatory commit for 21 plus 12 months.
Right. So it'd be a 33-month commit.
Thank you.
So if I use if I'm threatening with a knife, it's 21-month stay. If I'm threatening with a gun, then it's a 33-month commit. And if I discharge the gun, then it's a 33-month commit, non-waivable. That's the way this scenario would work. And if I was not allowed to even possess the gun due to a prior crime of violence, then it'd be another 12 months. Okay. So, so, and keep in mind, this is, I mean, there's no, so let's go to felon in possession. So mere felon in possession. So if I possessed ammunition, right now that'd be 5 years after a crime of violence conviction. I have a prior crime of violence conviction and I possess ammunition. That's now a 5-year mandatory minimum. There would be no impact that would not apply on this chart. If I possessed a firearm in my gun safe or in my closet, there would be no impact. It would not go in this chart because I would not be personally possessing the firearm. If I personally possessed a firearm, there would be a 6-month increase. So the duration would go from 21 months to 27 months. I'd
For
probably,
felon in possession?
for felon in
But
possession,
wouldn't you have to also commit a designated crime?
that is a designated crime.
Felon in possession.
Felon in possession is a designated crime, correct? Yep, so because felon in possession is a designated crime, it'd go up from 21 to 27 months. But you don't get the second bump, right?
Okay,
You don't get the extra 6 months for committing a designated crime. So so I get 27 months, but it'd still be a stay. Chances are I've got a criminal history score higher than 0 because I have this prior crime of violence, but let's assume that that's not true. For sake of simplicity, because I don't have the grid memorized, let's just assume it's still 21 months, criminal history score 0. Maybe it decayed. Maybe I did it a long time ago. So, or maybe it was a 5th degree controlled substance crime and it's only worth half a point. But anyway, so it would go from 21 to 26. Now let's say that in the course of possessing the firearm, I somehow used it. I'm not sure if there's a scenario for that, but maybe, somehow I brandished the firearm without committing another crime. In that case only, then it would go 21 months plus 12, so it'd be 33 months presumptive commit. So to change from a stay to a commit. Does that make sense? So I think the most plausible scenario for felon in possession without committing another crime would be this additional 6 months added to 21 months. So it'd be 27 months, but it'd still be a stay unless your criminal history score had earned you a commit. And then you'd be looking at a commit, but for 6 months longer because you were possessing a firearm on your person and it wasn't ammunition. So that's it in a nutshell. We'll be going through this while they'll be leading us through some of these decision points, but I just wanted to give you an overview of what was going on, and I appreciate the questions. So where are we? So the way I see things, so this is in Nate's world, our August meeting is really limited. Okay, so statutorily we turn into pumpkins the day after we file our report, and this task force expires the day after we file our report, and we have to file our report no later than August 15th, 2026. So what are we doing in our August meeting? We're just approving the final report. We really don't have the ability. I mean, I've been on task force before where the chair kind of does the final report, and I've seen things in there that like, I never agreed to this, but I really think in fairness to you, that's not the way to do it. The chair should not be making decisions without the task force. The task force should be reviewing the final report. The only thing we should be doing is changing wording and changing organization. Anything we don't like about the final report, it's basically copy editing at that point. We should not be making policy decisions. I'm not saying we can't, but they should be minor at that point because the writer has very little time to implement the changes that we make at that meeting before the August 15th deadline. Don, remind me of our August date again, please. Okay. So what that means is at our July meeting, and I'm also going to ask you for a July meeting. Okay, so it's August 4th. At our July meeting, we have to finalize our policy, right? We have to make our final decisions. I'd like everybody here, if possible, at our July meeting, because I'd like to know what the vote is. I'd like to be able to represent to the legislature what the recommendation was from the task force. And whatever, you're all here for a reason. You're all filling a particular seat. And I'd like everybody to be here. Yes, Judge Harris.
I'm just wondering, I know I won't be able to be at the July meeting, but if there's a way to provide a voter input in advance of it, would that be acceptable or does that violate the rules?
No, I think you could write a letter that was shared at the meeting if you wanted to, or a note or a memo or something. I don't think there's a provision for vote by proxy, but you could ratify if you were able to come to the August meeting, I think you could ratify your vote at that time. So we could count you in, as a yay or an nay for that vote. But I think it would be really helpful to know, July meeting will be at the Wilder Foundation. And what date is the July meeting?
July 10th.
Okay. So here's the thing is, nobody should be buying a pig in a poke, right? We need to know that, we need to know the numbers on this. We need to know what's the prison bed impact, what's the racial impact going to be, to the extent we can. And it's not always possible for us to estimate racial impact. By us, I'm referring to the staff of the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission. But we have to make a decision in July based on numbers. In order to run numbers, we have to have a policy that we're running the numbers on. So my goal for today is that those of us who are here come up with a preliminary agreement as to what is the best policy. Nobody's bound to this. This is purely preliminary. We're obviously going to make final decisions when we see the final numbers. But I think we have a lot of information, and I'd like to see us come to a preliminary. I think we have to come to a preliminary agreement. Otherwise, I don't know what I'm going to tell MSGC to run the numbers on. And I also want to run the language past the revisor's office, and I don't have any language to run past the revisor's office. They've agreed to help us, but I need to be able to. I need a decision from you, so I have something to tell those two groups, so we have a basis for making a decision in our July meeting. So having said all that, I do, and everything I'm talking about here for the most part has just been 6 and 11, but we still have 2 other areas to talk about. So with the hour we have left now, sorry, Julie's going to lead us through the main decision points that we have. Thank you. Take it away, Julie.
Good morning, everyone. Let's see if I'm sharing. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. So what we've done is we've taken that decision point document that Don shared and made some slides out of it. So we have about 16 decision points, and I know we're going to be getting a little bit into the weeds after we have just got that overarching description from Nate's documents. But now it won't forward. Hang on. Okay. So what I was thinking that we would do, and we want to make sure that we save space for talking, but we also are mindful of the hour that we have left. So the idea is that we'll go kind of through the decision points, looking at the first group, which is weapon enhancement reform, the second group, which is around firearm possession after the crime of violence, and then look at the predatory offender registration. The first idea, it has a bunch of, I think, 10 or 11 decision points in there. So what I've done is have the sort of look at it by decision point from kind of what some of these ideas are. Now, this might be something that we end up wanting to, we have a number of people who aren't here today. We want to get feedback, but we're trying just to gauge, where people are, if there's different things to be considered, which was part of your homework, I guess, is to think about things that maybe are not discussed or not one of these options. So if it works for everyone, we can kind of go through these questions, and then any discussion or any additional background that we need to get from Nate or anybody else who has ideas, please bring them forward. And then ideally we'd have enough information for Nate to be able to get what he needs to from the folks that he just mentioned. And then for Wilder to, add any sort of additional follow-up, or maybe we send a survey or something like that, we could figure it out, but at least we can kind of see where we are. So I'll start with the first decision point. And this, will be kind of, it's almost a replication of what the decision point document is that that Don sent out. So that decision point 1 is around the should a special penalty framework for committing crimes with a dangerous weapon assign the most serious penalty to those with the most serious criminal histories. So yeah, just to get people's pulse about where, and you can type it in the chat if you want to, by A, B, or C, but I also don't want it just, we're not only doing a survey. We want to make sure that we're getting people's feedback or where they need more clarification to be able to kind of weigh in of where they're leaning right now based on everything that we know.
And this means dangerous weapons, including firearms,
Yes.
the whole thing.
Yeah.
Can you explain what B means?
Yeah, so basically my hypothesis is that that this is true, that a special penalty framework for committing crimes with dangerous weapons, i.e. 60911, if you were to event 60911 today, should it assign the most serious penalties to those with the most serious criminal histories who most seriously involve dangerous weapons in committing the most serious crimes? And my argument is the answer is obviously yes, and that 60911 doesn't do this. It only even tries to do one of those points, the serious weapons involvement, but it doesn't scale it by the severity of the crime or the criminal history.
Yeah,
So
to me, it seems like the answer is either yes or no. Is it?
yeah, I don't think, I would argue 60911 doesn't accomplish it, and yeah, I mean, I guess there's another answer that
If it does, and if you think it does, then you vote no for a new framework. But let's see how it goes. Do you want us to vote in the
Tell
chat?
people to
Is that what
vote.
you're asking?
I would say A.
You would say A. Okay. So I'm seeing A's. I'm hearing from you, Mark, that no, maybe A.
I'm an A. Trying to see where to do messages. Got it.
No, I mean, I'll note it.
all right.
All right, so it looks like A is kind of where we're leaning there. So then the decision point number 2 is around incorporating the sentencing guidelines, recommendation sentences into the new penalty framework.
I'm going to vote A again.
Yeah, I'm A. These are the easy ones, I think.
Well, so far this is great. I think we have everyone. There is A's in the room as well. So let me get to this grid here. And some of this, Nate, correct me if any of this doesn't look right when we were trying to put it into a way to look at this, but the following types of weapon involvement in committing a designated offense have been ranked by seriousness and grouped into severity tiers. Is this the right ranking or grouping?
Just so I understand, you're asking whether this is an appropriate framework of least serious to most serious?
Yeah, and whether like the tiers are equivalent. So yeah, I don't know if this is exactly how I have it. Let's see. Yeah, I think I've got off person firearm possession at tier 0, but what did I put in them? Let's see. Actually, I don't see that in our materials. Do we have them?
This is
This
how it
I
looks
took
in
from
the
what you
material.
had sent over from,
Okay. I wonder if
Yeah.
Don sent that out. Do we have the
He sent it.
the decision points memo? Is that in the materials?
Yes.
yeah, I mean, that's.
Oh,
yeah,
is that, did I just not grab it?
He sent it on June 5th.
Oh, here it is. It was behind my computer. Sorry, Don. Yes. Yeah, I guess I had it, it's on, under decision point 1. Shoot. I don't know, this is a little different than what I said over, but.
Does off person mean like outside of the reach, or
Yeah,
like it's in the shed and they're in the house?
yeah, it could be in the trunk. I think glove box is probably in immediate reach, but I think trunk is not. So it's
It's like the
Whatever.
drug thing.
it's exactly like the drug thing. Yeah. I tried to avoid original ideas whenever possible.
So I'm going to comment that I feel like this seems to mirror decision making that happens in the court. And these seem to be the factors that are often considered. I think is the probably linking it to, so then is that our structure is probably our next question. And that's where I struggle a little bit, whether we want to get as granular as 5 tiers, or whether the distinction should be a little bit just, sort of in the original proposal, I think it was firearm use versus possession. I could see like discharge, use, possession, like those 3 also being maybe as granular as we get it for the purposes of a sentencing structure, and then discretion can deal with some of these other points. I'm just trying to think of like, does it get overly complicated if we go to 5 tiers? And that's what I keep struggling with, is like complexity versus better targeting of the penalty.
Yeah, and I like that. And even just sort of discharge use and actual possession versus constructive, and eliminating constructive and just keeping it at actual, I think makes it simpler too. And that eliminates the in the shed over there.
Well, and that's why it's called tier 0. I mean, the idea is tier 0 is not going to get any penalty. So this is, maybe I should share my original. Let's see here. I'm not looking.
And I understand that's tier 0, but for a prohibited person, that's tier 1. So it does.
Yeah, that's not how I had it originally though. So that's got a little lost in translation. Maybe I can, let me share what I originally had.
Well, and related to that question, Kelly, how would you address the difference between lawful and I don't remember what the other category was, prohibited possessor? Like, how would a 3-tier structure? I mean, I think I lean towards what you're saying, because it, like, these seem to be things that are going to be in some cases negotiated or litigated. I'm sorry, I have a visitor.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh.
It's a club soda, just so everybody knows.
Yeah, no, I like, I can and I think that those are, whether this is a repeat or a first time is another factor that is relevant. So it could, I don't know.
Is it a separate, like, is it a separate, because it's on the framework we just looked at a little bit ago, there were the 2 levels, the one for the using it and then the one for the prohibited person part of it, right? Or roughly. And so maybe it's 2 separate kind of calculations or 2 separate questions.
Yeah, I'm like, I can't give you a good answer, because this one like turns my brain inside out. I had one conversation with Shane, where he's like, it's sort of a question and answer. Like every case, there are a couple of questions that we need to answer to get to the right sentence. And I think he's right about that. And so that's what makes this so difficult. And those questions are things like, are you a prohibited person? Do you have a former crime of violence conviction? Did you discharge the weapon? Did you just possess the weapon? What's your criminal history? I mean, there's so many dimensions to this. It's hard.
Nate, I do have your, like, the written one right here if you want.
You're good. So basically, I mean, I think there's kind of two questions here. One is, is this the right order? Severity, like one, technically possessing a firearm, but not every person has been breached by using dangerous weapon other than a firearm while possessing a firearm on a person. So, are those equivalent? Should they be on the same tier? And is this kind of the right order? And then the standalone tier while possessing a firearm in a person when the possession is prohibited. And then I got tier 3 is using a firearm. 4 is
Nate, you just got real quiet. I'm having trouble hearing you.
shoot. I had my mic off the whole time. I'm sorry. Yeah. So tier 4 then is using the firearm. Tier 5 is yeah. So basically, then you start getting into these the discharge. Tier 5 includes discharge and the prior. So I guess the question is this the right order and are these the right tiers? Do we agree that it's as serious, for example, to use to discharge a firearm as it is to use a firearm with a prior non-decayed sentence for using a firearm to commit a designated offense?
To kind of simplify it, would it make sense to just say you bump up? I mean, if it were to go into like a more of like a 3-tier, that you just bump up a tier if you're a prohibited person, like that just adds, so you could keep it within within a more simple framework, but it would be an additional, if you're a prohibited person, then you would have to like +1 tier sort of thing.
Yeah.
Instead
well,
of
that's
having
effective.
it.
Yeah. That is
That's what
effectively
it is
this
doing, but it kind of simplifies the idea, I think, maybe.
Potential related but alternative would be almost like how the second degree. Now, this would not work with 60911 crimes that are higher, like egg robbery. You'd still need some kind of a system, so maybe it doesn't work. But throwing it out there as second degree and felon in possession are the main ones. Is building a statute that has these. So kind of like second degree assault with substantial bodily harm is a 7, where it's lower if it's just second degree assault. Where you use 5, 6, and 7 severity levels. 7 is the like felon in possession with a prior crime of with use or discharge, and then maybe severity level 6 is possession of ammunition or possession while using, or things like that, where that's how you build this the differentiation. And that probably is, you'd have to see what that looks like too, but just want to throw out that idea as a way to.
Well, I mean, there's dozens of crimes. There's dozens of crimes on the list. So I think so. So just to be clear, we're not at this point. This is an earlier decision, so we're not trying to figure out what the penalties are going to be.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't even penalize tier 1 or tier 2. I don't know. I mean, it's up to you. But But the question is this the right order, and are these worthwhile distinctions, and are these the correct tiers? For example, is it more serious? So this list has the following assumption: it's more serious to use a firearm than to merely possess a firearm. Does that make sense? It's more serious to use or possess a firearm after a crime of violence, where you were prohibited from even having it due to the crime of violence, than it is to use or possess a firearm in general. Is that a valid assumption? Is possessing a firearm on your person or in immediate reach while you're committing one of these crimes? This is all while you're committing one of these crimes. Is possessing a firearm on your person or in immediate reach as serious as using a dangerous weapon other than a firearm? That's another assumption that's built in here. Again, we're not getting into penalties yet. I guess the question is, does this make sense? Is it as serious to discharge a firearm in the commission of a designated offense as it is to use a firearm in the commission of a designated offense after you had already done that a previous time and been sentenced for that?
If I'm looking at this as a spectrum of conduct, I would agree that I think you've got it going from least severe to most severe.
I mean, and I don't want to get ahead. I agree of the spectrum of conduct, it goes that way. But boy, this starts getting really complex, I think, for practitioners to start figuring stuff out and to be litigating these things when we have, I mean, on this, it's actually 5+ tiers, which is why I like the simplicity of something that's maybe 3, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess technically it's 6 tiers because there's tier 0, but I wasn't envisioning a 5+.
It's good there's 5+ on here.
Yeah.
There's actually 5+ and a 5+ over. So
yeah,
we're kind of, I guess, if we include 0.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe it's easier just to focus on the screen then. What changes would folks make to this, I guess, is my question. What would you put something in a different order? Again, we'll assign penalties to these later, but
I personally think discharging the firearm is more serious than the one above it. Like actually shooting the gun.
So
is
it
more
should be
serious than, like, I would put that as a separate thing. I mean, I guess we're just putting these in order of least to most, right? And to me, like,
yeah, least to most, and grouping by severity, because we don't want to have an infinite number of tiers. This has already been pointed out. So we'd like to consolidate them to the extent that they're equivalent. We'd like to find that equivalency here.
I mean, my suggestion would be to remove the tiers first, put them in order, and then create the tiers if they seem natural.
Sure.
But I just think, because discharging a firearm probably means you're using it, you're displaying, or clearly you pulled it out at some point, and you actually are, you did something that could have put somebody's life in danger. Literally, seems like it's a more over and above anything else on that list.
Yeah, and it is at the bottom, so that's implied by that. So the sequence is intended to do the first thing you're talking about, like put them from least to most severe. And then the tiers are intended to group things that are similar. I mean, if you think that should be tier 6, that's a valid thing to think. If that should be on its own level. And maybe you don't think the prior is that big of a deal.
I agree that discharging maybe warrants its own tier. I also wonder if, tier 0, since it's really hard to picture committing an offense with possession of a firearm not on one's person or immediate reach. I know we could think of one if we sat here, but I don't know how often that's going to get used. The first tier 1, brandishing, displaying, threatening a dangerous weapon other than a firearm, so many of the offenses that's going to apply to are offenses that have that as the elements, like aggravated robbery, aggravated carjacking, second-degree assault. Or, I mean, if you're going to commit another offense and you're actually brandishing the dangerous weapon, you're probably guilty of second-degree assault in that case.
And actually, carjacking and robbery are not on the list of only second-degree assault is, but carjacking and robbery, you do not have to commit with a weapon. You can commit by inflicting bodily harm, or you can commit with a fake weapon.
I agree, but if you commit it with a dangerous weapon, then it's accounted for in the element. If you commit a simple robbery with the dangerous weapon, it's an aggravated robbery.
But if you commit first degree ag rob, there's, like I said, 3 different ways of doing it, and you don't know just by the statute, which it is. So I'm saying this would be an additional penalty for first degree ag rob, the way I've got it designed.
Sure, I'm just trying to
clear.
simplify, because,
Sure.
I mean, now there's 3 different kinds of aggravated robbery.
Right.
So,
Well, Julie, you got any?
I was going to say, I think that maybe we can try and figure out a way to share this. I actually did have a slide in the back in case this one was better. So this is that slide, which I'm sorry I didn't pull up earlier. Wasn't sure which way to share this exact piece, but that might be one of the things that we have to follow up with, either ask people to look at an email or try and squeeze it in if we have time today or on July. But
We can't do email meetings. That's the problem. We
Oh,
have
that's
to
right.
make a decision today. Well, we could give it to a subcommittee that's sub quorum, but we can't have a meeting by email.
So that reminder. So it sounds like people are, we're moving towards the right direction in the way of ranking it, but there are all these caveats, and therefore perhaps going to a more simple version of possession versus use versus discharging, and having some piece of a prohibited person is something that should be thought out. So I kind of feel like maybe we need to flesh it out a bit, and then I don't know if it's doing that subcommittee meeting or if it's talking about it in July, but I'm not sure how that means for you looking at data, Nate, to pull from where you need. I mean, is this something that would prevent you from?
Well, why don't we just go on and see if it kind of gels as we move on.
Okay. We go back to. Okay, so now we're in decision point 4. So how does the firearm use or possession fit best? And this is for accomplices. I'm sorry, that was the key point here.
And A is basically 6911's position. Accomplice, defendant, same thing. And B is what I'm proposing in both of these versions is that there should be some advanced knowledge that the accomplice was likely to possess the firearm during the crime, or it doesn't make sense to hold the accomplice, the defendant, liable.
I would vote B.
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 And what is your E?
Oh, I said B.
Oh, B. Okay. All right. Okay. B.
So B, but it should be use.
So for Amber, for you, it's in just firearm use, not possession. Is that what you mean by your statement or by what you typed?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess if it was likely they knew in advance that I think like the firearm would be used to help facilitate the crime, so that it was used during, brandished or whatever, that was known going in. Because I don't know if you can necessarily know that they're gonna just possess it if they don't actually use it.
Okay.
Well,
I think it gets a little.
but yeah, they would have to use it, but well, to get the big punishment, they'd have to use it, but the knowledge wouldn't, I think it's really hard to say whether you knew that somebody was going to use it versus just possessing it. I think if you knew somebody was going to possess it, I feel like that's enough to know that there's a possibility they would have used it, right? You're going into a crime together. So you're liable for the crime as an accomplice, and you know that one of your cohorts has a gun going into the crime. I feel like it's not unreasonable to hold you responsible for the extra penalty that it would accrue to that firearm use. I feel like it's automatically foreseeable then that the firearm would be used. I don't know. That's how I look at it, but
I guess then maybe I'd take issue with likely. I think I think it could get really complicated. Likely possessed. So then it would, I guess, whether or not he has a history of possessing a firearm would become opposed to that specific instance. I don't know. I think B. I just don't know if I like it the way it is.
Amber, what if I'm sorry.
no, I was gonna say I wrote B for you, Amber. So if you want different language, because I had originally the whole the aiding and abetting panoply apply to the use of the firearm, but
What if it was no or had reason to know?
yeah, but you're talking about a current future event. That's why I use likely, because the criminal law does use likely, but
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe that's something, maybe folks would be okay if maybe I could just hammer that out. I don't know. Yeah, it does
Just
make
trying to
things
think
more
of
complicated.
possible scenarios. Like it could be one where, because you're hanging out ahead of time and they have a firearm on them, right? And then it could be one where you meet up and you have no idea what they have in their backpack or whatever. So I don't.
Yeah, well, you got to know in advance. You got to know before
Right.
if you're in the middle of the crime and he pulls out, I think at that point you're kind of an unwitting accomplice with respect to the gun use. But before the crime, you got to, well,
I tend to agree that I think it's cleaner if it's just basically you knew they were going to possess it. The likelihood, I agree with Amber. I think that's gonna make for a level of complexity in elements that is going to cause a lot of problems.
So Shane has an idea of, given the complications mentioned, keep punishment the same, but remove at least any hard mandatories.
And I could support that.
It would allow for, I guess, what we are talking about right now, how much they knew or if they were surprised to be taken into consideration if it's not a hard mandatory, and give discretion. Yeah, that might be cleaner.
Yeah, I mean, the
So-
general rule is that an accomplice is equally liable, which is, very simple. I think the issue is whether you've got room for nuance on sentencing. And, from the bench perspective anyway, even if it's a mandatory, but it's a soft mandatory, that gives a judge some room on sentencing to factor all of that in.
okay.
So then A with caveats.
Yeah. So unwitting accomplice, okay, if it's not a hard mandatory. That's what I'm hearing.
Does that work for?
I still like B.
Okay, we still have B's. At least it narrows it down.
Do we want to take a vote on it or get a show of hands? Because I need to know which version to submit.
Yeah, so if you can just put your, it sounds like we're either A or B.
I don't understand actually what we're talking about. I'll be honest. Like I really don't understand what that puts us. What box does Shane's recommendation put us in?
So what?
I don't understand.
So it takes us back to 60911. It's basically an accomplice's possession of a firearm is imputed to, or use of a firearm is imputed to the defendant. Even if the defendant didn't know about it, but that can never result in a hard mandatory. So the judge can take into account, judge has the discretion to take into account the defendant's ignorance or lack thereof in deciding whether to apply the mandatory minimum.
I guess I can't say one way or the other without knowing what the whole scheme is, because I can't agree to that right now without knowing what the primary actor is going to be facing.
It's hard to vote on this without knowing if there's even a soft mandatory, which I don't know that we're at yet, but that's part of the new proposal, not the old proposal.
Yeah.
So that's fair. Okay. Maybe
I
table
guess
that.
my concern with these soft mandatories generally is what we've been seeing in the data, which is that they're regionally different. They're differently applied regionally and to different groups of people. And so when we default, if we default to A, or if we have A, but then, you know, say that if the person didn't know, or what was it? Given the same, but remove at least so then we're basically removing. So if it's not the person who had the gun, and they have the same sentence, but it's a soft rather than a hard mandatory. I mean, I guess to me that's defaulting to the more serious as opposed to, and so you're going to get some places where it's going to be, you know, some districts where it's going to be just more frequently that people are like judges are going to depart, and then you're going to get other districts where judges just are not going to depart, and it's going to vary quite a bit, and it's going to be all over the place. And I think it just changes. To me, it seems like it changes, like when we're negotiating soft and hard for some elements of things, it just moves the pieces around, but gets the same outcome.
And I guess maybe I can vote. I still stick with B because we just had a whole session on, or 2 sessions ago on, you know, looking at accomplice liability in general and how disparate those sentences ended up being, especially if the accomplice is the one who pleads before the main actor is sentenced, and then they get a harsher sentence. Like all kinds of things happen that don't make sense. So it doesn't make sense to me for us to continue down that road. I think we need to build in the fact that the accomplice probably is working at a different level of liability if they were not the one who was directing the crime. And if they were, then that's going to also have to be dealt with at sentencing.
So I'm just throwing out another, I think this is what I heard some people saying. We take out the word likely and add had reason to know, or had reason to know. Is that, Amber, does that improve, and Judge Harris, does that improve things for you in terms of trial proof and complexity?
Does that add dangerous weapon now though? Where it was just firearm on this?
It'd just be firearm in the use paragraph and firearm or other dangerous weapon in the, yeah, I mean, you can disregard that for these purposes right now, but if we're talking about a dangerous weapon, then yeah, it would apply to dangerous weapons.
I mean, that language tracks better with other statutes. I'm not sure it makes it any easier at trial.
Okay.
I'll defer to the prosecutors on that with if they think they were going to try to prove that up, how they do it. But you're getting a little far into the weeds about that.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Yeah, it's better. I think it's still complicated, but I guess that is how some offenses are.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems to me that, okay, so I'm liable for the crime that you commit because, you know, I meet the aiding and abetting standard. It doesn't, to me, seem fair, though, that I should also be liable for firearm possession or firearm use that you commit that I had no idea was going to happen. You know, I thought
agree.
this was a completely different kind of, I did not know this is how this day was going to go. You know, I knew we were going to commit the crime together, but I didn't know we were going to do it like this. But it just seems a bit unfair to me.
And I think that sort of thinking tracks how they've been treating like liability or accomplice liability for like felony murder and that sort of thing.
Right.
And you need to know it's going to get that bad before you sign up for it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, maybe we could revisit this after we go to 1.5. 1.5 is kind of the main event, isn't it?
So with 1.5 on the paper version, there's a couple different ways that we look to approach it, and we opted on the latter one for the slide. So what should the additional punishment be at each severity tier? So now we're talking into many options. And I don't know, Nate, I think this was sort of the way you had shared it with us when we put it together. And then those ones before were kind of breaking it into 2 steps, but we'll just look at the slide for now. And if we need to move to the paper version, we can.
And my suggestion is, why don't we start with tier 3? So tier 3 is using a firearm to commit one of these crimes. You know, we've kind of established the idea that it should be built on the guideline sentence because that incorporates criminal history and it incorporates offense severity. And now we're trying to incorporate the additional factor of using a firearm. So using, whether by brandishing, displaying, threatening, etc., but not discharging. So that kind of using. What should the penalty be for that? Should there be an increased penalty? What should it be? Should it change the? And both of these support 12 months. Is 12 months too high? Is 12 months too low? The second one is different though, because it makes there be a mandatory prison disposition, a waivable mandatory prison disposition. Whereas the first one just says, we'll take whatever the guidelines say. And I think this goes back to Julia's data that this is kind of the crux of what Julia was talking about with these are the cases that the guidelines disposition has changed. And we saw a very high, 2/3 departure rate on those. So I think if you look at Julia's data, that would militate toward staying in option A. And, but if you think that all use of a firearm should go to prison, if you use a firearm to, and you know, Julia's data, right, is based on the status quo, which treats firearm use and firearm possession the same. So maybe the departure rate would go down if we were just talking about firearm use. So I guess that would be the argument for option B. You know, let's try option B and see what the departure rate is for that.
Is option A essentially the May proposal and option B is sort of the June proposal, and sort of option B is
correct.
Let's have mandatory minimums.
Yeah, option B is applying a waivable mandatory prison disposition. So that's the mandatory minimum. So the mandatory minimum is grid time executed.
My only concern on option B is that the way the case law is developed on departures, if it's a decision on dispositional departure, it's based on the offender. So that's where you get into the amenability of probation. if you're focused on the severity of the offense or the unique circumstance of the offense, that usually is only limited to durational departures. So if you take one of these enhancements and bump something out of the shaded portion of the grid, into the shaded portion of the grid, that does put some constraints on the judge's ability to do a departure if you just think it's because the offense is less serious than usual. And I don't have a great answer for how to do that right now, but that's my concern anyway, with using these enhancements to bump you above the line or to the shaded portion of the grid or unshaded portion of the grid.
Rob?
So my question, Nate, if you could just clarify why, I'm curious why looking at a flat rate or a flat increases versus like proportional.
I mean, that could be done. I don't think of it as flat because it's on top of whatever duration it was. So, you know, if it's.
Well, but like the example we talked about earlier, who a person was looking at a 21-month sentence, and then they get 12 months added on top or whatever. That's a 33. So they're looking at like a 60% or 55% increase over and above what they would originally have been sentenced. But then another person who was I don't remember what the other one we were looking at was, but who's up in the 48 months, right? Then that's I think it was first degree robbery or something, 48 months presumptive sentence, then they get added 12. So that's like a 25% increase, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be the issue for every crime, no matter how it works, because at 0, you have this higher number, and then with each successive number, it's a smaller number. So that percentage increases for any crime across the guidelines. I've only seen one instance, I think it was in failure register, where you have going from 0 to 1 is a smaller increase than further points down the line. They're always usually, it only depends on the severity level. So some it's every point added, you go plus 10, others is plus a lower number. So that lower percentage is built into the guidelines already.
So, I mean, Rob brings up a valid point. So there's a crime called criminal sexual predatory conduct, which is not really a crime. It's an enhancement basically to these limited predatory crimes, which aren't, everybody gets confused on what those are. But if you commit one of those crimes, and I think like robbery is one of those crimes, for example, or kidnapping, I'm not sure. But if you commit one of those crimes motivated by sexual impulses or part of a predatory pattern of behavior, essentially, that had criminal sexual conduct as its goal, then you get a 25% increase in the statutory maximum penalty. And the sentencing guidelines convert that into a 25% increase in the guidelines recommended duration. So that's kind of what you'd be talking about, Rob, is you do so somebody who commits a second degree intentional murder with a firearm then would be looking at 25% increase in the duration under that kind of scenario. And I'm just throwing out 25% because that's what CSPC is, but which would be huge. And somebody who commits a second degree assault with a firearm would be looking at a 25% increase, which would be relatively tiny. And that's a different approach. That's a valid approach, but that's different from what's being proposed here. It'd just be 12 months on top of whatever they earned.
I mean, yes, I agree that it's huge, I guess, but so is the murder part of it, right? Or the you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And so like when we're talking about proportional, like I guess what we're talking about here is just putting on, increasing the like as you said, increasing the presumptive or I guess in this case it would be the commit, right? The guideline sentence commit or whatever. But it seems like it's going to have a much bigger impact on, those severity level 5s and 6s and whatever, then it's going to have on, because if you're doing 9 years and then you got to do another year, doing 10 versus 9 is, quite a bit, maybe less of, yeah, I don't know. It's less substantial than it is if you go from doing a 21-month probation to a 33-month prison. But I mean, it's really, it's not. I was just wondering what the motivation was to go versus.
I think the way
flat
I'm
versus
looking at
proportional.
this is sort of an additional punishment for a separate factor, so that should apply evenly regardless of what the other behavior was, because you're getting a different punishment for that other behavior.
Yeah.
I think an issue that I have with option B and the sort of new proposal is, a few months ago we were talking about, we're kind of a guideline state, we're kind of a mandatory minimum state. The guidelines do a lot of work. Let's let the guidelines work. And what I liked about the original proposal, and that this is sort of back to, let's have mandatory minimums again, but they seem even more complex now. I think this is going to be harder for practitioners to track when the mandatory minimums are applying. I think Judge Harris just pointed out another complexity with how the departures are going to work. So many of these offenses are already going to be in the presumptive commit already, which makes it very clean then for people to know how the departures are going to work. And mandatory minimums have, as we've seen today and other stuff, such a bad just reputation with people. And I understand that these work better than 60911 in tying themselves closer to the guidelines and considering things, but it really just feels like sort of paying lip service to something that's a popular thing to run on in the legislature, but very unpopular with seemingly everyone else, when the guidelines are going to take care of so much of this already. I mean, we'll probably get to the non-waivable ones. I have thoughts on those. I'll sit on those for now, but I mean, I would be an A at this point.
And really, back to Rob's point, I mean, there are two questions here. Well, more than two questions. One is, should it be a static durational increase? Should it be a percentage increase? If if it should be a static durational increase, is 12 months the right number? Should it be a different number of months? I mean, I just picked that because that's what we currently do for crimes committed for the benefit of a gang, and now it's what we do for crimes committed while impersonating a peace officer. But that may not be necessarily the right answer. It's just a round number. It's also easy to communicate. Hey, you get an extra year if you use a gun, so keep your gun at home if you're going to go out committing crimes. I mean, I think that's hopefully what we're trying to get across.
I've had multiple prosecutors and public defenders tell me they went to law school because they didn't do math. So when you start talking about increasing things by percentages, that's math. I don't have a real problem with a flat increase in sentences. It's a sentence enhancement based on use or possession of a firearm. I guess I would lean toward A right now. I would have no problem with taking the increases from B and incorporating that into A, as long as it doesn't change the disposition.
Well, maybe we should take our win here and see if we can get agreement on the plus 12 months duration, and then talk about disposition separately. Is everybody in agreement with an increase of 12 months duration for firearm use while committing a listed crime?
Tier 3?
For tier 3, yeah. We're just talking about tier 3. So.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, so. All right, I mean, doesn't look like anybody's a no. Are you a yes, Kelly? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I don't know. Are you?
Yeah.
Okay. So all right, we got something here. We got plus 12 months duration for using a firearm while committing a listed crime. And I think that's something we can build off of because everything else is more or less serious in some way. But now we got to figure out the disposition. So let's talk about that. Should we get rid of mandatory minimums just to add back in mandatory minimums?
Well, I guess I'll speak first on that because basically what option A does is it says you will get probation if you shoot a weapon at a person. That is something that's completely unacceptable.
Well, we're not talking about discharge at this point, Shane. So this is using
Well,
whether,
what's use then?
brandishing, displaying, threatening. Somebody had the list memorized. Yeah, or otherwise employing, I think is what it is.
Well, I guess I'm
so-
kind of there too for that offense as well.
Yeah.
Because people
yeah.
are very frightened when someone's waving a gun at them.
No, I think for discharge, I don't think.
No, I think that's for use too. Then.
Yeah, that's
So
that's a special
to me,
case.
To me, it's bigger to go from possession only to then brandishing and otherwise using.
Yeah, right now we've got discharge in tier 5, I believe.
Right.
So, but we're on tier 3, which
with
is
that being
use.
said,
So use without discharge. I mean, I'm okay with. I guess I probably prefer A, but I'd go with B if that was going to get us to consensus. So I'm really not. I know Shane, you like B. You like A.
Yeah, I've been going back and forth with this for days. I think I'm more at A. Like I could get to a mandatory when we get down to discharge.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so I think I'm at A.
All right. Anybody
So,
else?
I think I'm, willing to go with a bit of a hybrid as well. One thing I was just thinking about is if on top, and I don't know, I don't remember exactly how your June model works on this, Nate, but like I'm more inclined to have non-waivable mandatories on repeat offenses.
Yeah, that's the repeat offenses were also tier 5. So basically option A is
Okay.
the April, May model. Option B is the June model. So so it definitely would have, let's just assume right now it's just somebody uses a fire.
Yeah, I think I see that. I didn't catch the no change to disposition in 3,
Yeah.
4, 5.
So this could be like an armed robbery where somebody at gunpoint. This could be the waving the gun around road rage incident. This could be pointing a gun at somebody, but there's no discharge, there's no priors, and you're not prohibited from possessing the weapon due to a prior crime of violence. That's what we're talking about here. So I don't know.
Right now we have 2 for A and 1 for B.
So why don't you just poll the people who haven't responded yet?
All right. Amber, Mark, Rob, and Judge Harris, and you, Nate.
I'm going to go with the majority probably. So.
Okay.
I think I'm more inclined for A. this point?
I guess of these two options, I would be more aligned with A. I could see where Q would replace P, but right, like wouldn't that, which is essentially what. So then it would be, because right now P isn't. Right now P would be, like Shane said, could still stay a presumptive probation, isn't that right? Or no?
Well, we haven't gotten to tier 5 yet. We're stuck on tier 3, and hopefully
Oh,
things.
sorry. Okay.
Yeah, so we're just talking about bread and butter. No priors, no prior crime of violence,
Okay.
no
A.
discharge. So you're A, okay.
I vote A.
All right, well then I'm going to be A.
So we have 1B that I counted.
Okay. All right, so I think that's a good starting point, and now we can kind of pivot from that. So, so 4 is adding onto that the. Let me pull up tier 4 here. So tier 4 is just the same as tier 3, but you've got the prior crime of violence conviction. So you shouldn't have even possessed the firearm in the first place. And this is really our replacement for the, well, I mean, yeah, so this is where you get the penalty for the prior crime of violence. Should there be a penalty? Should it be double? Should it be less than double? And should there be, should this be where the prison disposition changes? If it wasn't changing at 3, should it change here?
I can vote B on this one. If they've got a prior to make them a prohibited person and the firearms used during the offense, I'm fine with moving that to a different part of the grid.
Okay. So and you're good with the doubling too. So that the doubling, so the penalty increases by 24 months, not just 12 months.
I'm flexible on that, but I don't have a problem with 24.
Okay.
Okay, what's hanging me up on this one? This is the prior is a crime of violence, right? That's the definition.
Yep. Which could be fifth
Fifth
degree.
degree drug crimes.
So,
Most of them are that. And that's where I'm having a real trouble with it being a mandatory or the disposition changing.
right.
You know,
So it almost depends on what we decide on the other question.
yeah, I mean, well, I mean, if we change the crimes of violence definition, then I could easily be in column B. Much more easily be there, but if we don't, I definitely can't be there. But even if we change the definition, then we'd have to do something for all the people that have been convicted of fifth degree in the past. So that also makes it a little wonky.
All right, we're at time. Can we keep rolling? All right, well, I'm going to keep rolling. I guess if you got to go, you got to go. But
Did we lose quorum?
yeah, if we lose quorum, we can't really vote anymore. But we're not really voting. I mean, basically, yeah, we could just keep talking, and I could be informed by our talking as to what I submit to the MSGC and to the revisor's office. So, okay. So, so that's an interesting point. So we've got, Member Mitchell saying she'd support B conditionally. So maybe we'll just have that as a category, and talk about whether we're going to change the list, or should we talk about changing the list now? What do you think, Julie?
Well, we have this option C here, so we could put it in the option C category as basically option B, as long as no fifth degree drug.
Yeah, or other
As
changes.
long as the prior crime of violence is not 5th degree.
That's right.
Yeah.
Drugs, yeah.
And I know I put this in my comments for the subgroup, but I'm in agreement about taking some of those 152 crimes out of the crime of violence definition.
Yeah, I actually think, I think there's going to be support for that, is my impression. But so let's say that that's a thing. So let's call that option C. And there's, you know, any number of other options. Again, I'll support whatever the majority is supporting. At least everything we've talked about so far. So option A is 24 months, no change to disposition. Option B is 24 months commit, potentially waivable depending on whether they fit in option tier 5. And then option C is same as option B, but conditioned on us changing the list of crimes of violence.
I'm still A.
Okay.
Judge Harris, did you say you were C, or am I putting words in your mouth?
I mean, I guess I kind of see this as a chicken or the egg thing. I do want to see the definition narrowed. I can support B regardless right now.
Okay, so you're B or C.
Correct.
Okay. Rob?
I could go A or B or A or C.
Interesting. Shane?
Well, I'd say I'm B. I've thrown out there several times about the list. I'd rather focus on changing a list than like having a 10-year off ramp or things like that. So
Okay.
I guess I'm in B, expecting some tweaking of the list.
Okay.
I'm B or C. I'm B or C.
Okay. Amber?
Ah, fudge.
I think A or C. There's tweaking of the list.
Okay. Well, it sounds like my vote is for C.
Yeah, that was.
So, all right. Because I've heard lots of A or C or B or C and just C. So, all right. So this is good. 5 then. So this is what we had in tier 5, which is one by using. So you're committing a listed crime with a firearm after you had a previous non-decayed sentence for using a firearm to commit a designated offense. And then the other, so and then the other one in tier 5 is discharging the firearm used to commit the designated crime. And this is where some people have talked about a mandatory minimum. Well, I guess we have a mandatory minimum potentially in that, but
You know what? Am I just not understanding this? Isn't attempted murder a very likely possible charge in any sort of discharge? I mean, other than like in this scenario where it's a crime of violence that would be listed there.
it
I
would.
guess I'm not understanding how it doesn't already get taken care of by possible charging of.
Well, this would apply to
that.
attempted murder, right? I mean, so this would add a penalty to attempted murder. And it would also make it a, non-waivable prison commit. So, yeah, I mean, that's the
I
thing
guess
is
I'm just saying,
we're not used to thinking about 611 as applying to the really serious crimes because
right.
people have graduated from this. But under this, there would be, these penalties would apply to very serious crimes, more so than the less serious crimes, which is kind of the goal.
I think the problem I have with the non-waivable is there's always going to be the case where the judge would say, God, I wish I could depart, but I can't. I know when I submitted sort of my policy feedback, one thing I had, especially on a first-time discharge, is you could have an imperfect self-defense case where maybe there's just one element of self-defense that you don't meet, where you used a firearm and now you can't get a departure. You can't negotiate around that even on a plea agreement. And as I said in what I sent to you, Nate, of sort of, I don't know if anyone's that unlucky twice, but at least the first time through, you know, and then the other one in the June as well, you can always find the case where you want to. And having a non-waivable mandatory minimum just removes being able to exercise that discretion in the rare case. Because that's when departures are supposed to happen, is the rare case.
Okay, so one option that we don't have up here, because option A is modeling after my April, May, which didn't have any mandatory minimums, is we don't have the waivable mandatory minimum option up here. You know, where it would be mandatory prison. If there's a discharge or a prior, and I would certainly think that there probably should, I mean, that's, if we're gonna have a mandatory minimum for, you know, using a firearm after a prior crime of violence, I think we should also have a mandatory minimum for using a firearm with you know, having previously been subject to that, or with a when you discharge the firearm. So I think there should be another option. Shane, you want to vote on this before you go?
Is scheduling another meeting an option?
What's that? Is having
I think we
another,
have quite a bit left to cover. Is scheduling an additional meeting an option?
yeah, I mean, if it's legally an option, I don't know if it's logistically an option. I mean, part of the problem is it's going to take a honking long time for the MSGC staff to figure this out. But I mean, I guess we've already agreed on something, so maybe. I don't know. Next Friday's a holiday, so we can't do it then. And I'm going to be out of town Friday after that. Any ideas, Don?
I mean, would it be, well, okay, so like if you're saying next week's out, could we look 2 weeks out? That would give your staff probably only about 2 weeks to get an estimate in.
I will be out of town
On the 26th.
on the 26th. Yeah,
Does it have to be on a Friday?
not necessarily. I'm open next Thursday.
I'm not,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Well, maybe I could get them started on what we have, which isn't insignificant.
I mean, probably what another approach is we have a meeting on July 10th. Maybe we try to schedule a second meeting in July. Like you said, you could potentially get them started on what you know now. We make some further decisions in July that give them the ability to run more. And if we meet again, we can review those. If it's like July 24th, I don't know.
It does feel like this is really pushing it to try to do this without another meeting.
Yeah.
I mean, is there ability to do something again in June? Since
Well-
we didn't get to half of this today, that's already.
Maybe we could try a doodle poll. See what's available.
Would it be helpful to start with what works for this group, maybe, just to narrow it down a little bit, and we can hold places and then see what the other people. So like I couldn't.
What if we looked at like June 29th or 30th?
So I have a family reunion starting on the 24th.
Okay.
So it has to be before the 24th for me.
What about Monday, the 22nd in the morning?
I would be available that day.
Yeah, I could make it work.
June 24th in the morning?
22nd, the Monday.
I can try to get out of some of what I've got on that Monday, but I'm not positive they can find a replacement for me. I'm actually going to do senior judge work that day.
Yeah, and that might be hard for Shane too, because it's a Monday after a weekend when people are held in jail.
Although he was able to meet with us on Monday.
That's true. That's true.
Like I'm available.
Okay, so that's a possibility, and then maybe another day.
What about the 23rd? I could do any time on the 23rd.
I'm at a conference, but I in DC, but that could be. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm good at least until 11 on the 23rd.
Morning on the 23rd is, how about for others?
I have something.
Amber can't, okay.
I might be
I've
able
got
to
a
move
free
it.
trial. I've got a free trial hearing.
And then I imagine, does it get worse the closer we get to the 4th of July? Do people have the 1st or 2nd?
I have those days.
What about the 30th? Are you not?
I'm still on vacation
Oh, you
on
are,
the
okay.
30th. Yeah.
I would be available the 1st or the 2nd.
You would not?
I
Or you
would. Yep.
Would, okay.
I would too.
It looks possible for.
Okay, so those are two
First and the
potential
second, yeah.
dates.
Donnie, you getting these?
I am too.
Okay.
I'm available 1st or 2nd.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
fine.
Great. None of us
And-
are 4th of July travelers, apparently.
So we have 6:22 in the morning. 6:23 doesn't sound as great, but that could be possible in the morning. And then 7:1 and 7:2 sound pretty open for people.
Yep.
Okay.
Just looking at availability, this room is available all 4 days.
Okay.
All 4 of those times this room is available.
Okay. And I have a question about the meeting at Wilder on is that July 10th?
Yeah.
Is there going to be a remote attendance option for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Same as it works now.
Same. Yeah. We'll use WebEx and.
Okay, so we're gonna send out a poll for those dates. You two can talk and
Sure.
figure out times. Can set out a poll. Come back together. To do the rest of the decisions.
All right. So we're kind of on agenda item 8, discuss July agenda items.
Yeah, so I think we were just trying to figure out what our agenda is, which glad we had that placeholder for. We don't need a whole bunch of time, but we meet as a debrief group next week or the week after. Next Tuesday. So we can figure out what the agenda is. But I think based on how this went, we know we have 2 agendas that we'll be figuring out, and that one of them will be finishing the decision points and then probably going through some of the data pieces. We have, so we're in the background doing the report writing. And so we were planning on at the July 10th meeting, having the draft report with the placeholders in there to share with everybody visually. So if that would we could do that July 10th as planned. It wouldn't have to sit in the middle meeting.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And yeah, probably getting through the decision points would be
Most important.
all we could handle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. And then discuss the timeline for the report.
That's it. Yeah,
That's
I have slides for that, but it's basically we're doing as much as we can in the background, knowing that there'll be things that you give us, that the group gives us to piece in there. We have met with MNJRC. They're going to be giving us their report this week or next week to embed in there. So that will be kind of what we share in July. And again, there'll be some placeholders, and we have to go through a whole copy editing process. And I think the main thing to know is that it helps that we're meeting April or August 4th and not August 15th or whatever that day is, because it gives us time to make any of those final revisions that the group has. But yeah, we're kind of a couple months off to where we originally thought, I think, in our contract and stuff, but we're working around that with MNJRC, and you know, we have a lot of things in there already. So I'll just say that we'll share that with the group on the 10th.
Good. Okay. Donna, are there any members of the public online who wish to make a comment? Okay. All right. Very good. So change to the meeting date. We'll have a meeting to be determined. Then it's July 10th in the morning, and our final meeting will be August 4th in the afternoon. If there's no objection, we'll be adjourned. Hearing no objection. Guys, great discussion, great information, and then great discussion, and we'll see you shortly. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.